Whether God exists or not, we have certainly made him a variety of houses and shaped the world and ourselves in the light and shade of divinity. Man has written endlessly, beautifully, inscrutably, and, he claims, truly in God's honor. Whether or not God created the world, mankind has lived and died in love and fear of him. But where does God actually live? Is it simply in the faithful hearts of his believers? And where does one go to begin to trace the relationship between God and man? Well, first things first, God's last known address, Jerusalem. There's not much risk of Jew or Christian or Muslim ever forgetting Jerusalem. In fractious piety, their competing faiths jostle for priority on the skyline. Domes and spires, crosses and crescents, only the Jews sport no obvious architectural symbols. If you could phone God from here, so the Jewish joke runs, it would only be a local call. Or you could always write to him.
We have here a letter, Jesus somewhere in Jerusalem. This one is written only to God.
This has no address. It came automatically to Jerusalem.
Usually people write only to God and they suppose that it will be delivered.
What sort of things do they ask for?
A few months ago, somebody wrote to God and he asked him to help to pay for electricity. So all of my workers gave a little bit of money to help him. After a while, he wrote again to God to help him to get married his daughter. So it was too much for us.
What will happen to these letters? Will you pass them on?
Most of the letter I deliver to the Wailing Wall. God's
mailbox, decidedly crammed, but not very often cleared. Perhaps God need not stoop to collection. He can scan his post at one all-seeing glance. Some write to God, others turn up at his house, or what's left of it, the Wailing Wall. Piety surges through them as if they were iron filings, invisibly impelled by a magnet. Where Jehovah's headquarters once stood, Muhammad took flight to heaven, and his followers erected the Dome of the Rock, a mosque where Jews do not dare or care to trespass. Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Memorial, just outside the city walls. Every tree here stands for one righteous Gentile who helped Jews when they were being hunted and murdered in Hitler's crusade, often to the applause of their God-fearing Christian neighbors. Whom God abandoned, these defended.
Well, you have to hope this isn't all the righteous Gentiles there were. This is the best that Christendom could do, is it? Not much of a showing. Certainly not a forest, is it?
Yet Christianity continues, as if Christ's self-sacrifice remained the literally crucial event of human history.
The philosopher Theodor Adorno said, after Auschwitz, no poetry. It's interesting that he didn't say after Auschwitz, no more God, even though he was in fact a Marxist. And when one looks at this piece of work, impressive and serious and honorable though it is, one wonders whether there can be any art after Auschwitz either. Because this, in a way, is a memorial which might be of a catastrophe, but cannot really ever deal with the catastrophe of the dimensions of Auschwitz. It's a if I may say so, almost a parody of what a memorial would be, just as our idea of God after Auschwitz is perhaps a parody of what he was before.
The Church of the Holy Sepulchre is, in its way, a parody of Christian unity. The tenancy of the Church is shared between Roman Catholics and Greek Orthodox, Copts and Armenians, Franciscans and Ethiopians, none of whom is exactly the loving neighbor of the next. Man and his God are nothing if not territorial, and heaven help the trespasser. The spot where Jesus' crucifix was supposedly erected, Calvary itself, where the Greeks hold sway. Their inscription insists that the Saviour's body was drained of blood before he could ascend into heaven, as if a kosher butcher had officiated at his execution. Above the queue waiting to kiss Jesus' tomb, a dome, reminiscent of Hadrian's Pantheon, where pagan gods and divine emperors were honored. On the roof are the Ethiopians. Ejected from the main body of the church after a territorial squabble, they squat in attics, left behind by the Crusaders. Closer to heaven, they at least have more room up here to store their pious props. There's another alternative Calvary, complete with its own sepulchre and tended by typically green-fingered Anglicans.
The Tomb Association was formed in 1893.
I was shown the supposed tomb of the condemned criminal Jesus by a very genial ex-probation officer. He admitted with British candour that it might very well not be the sacred spot at all. Still, at least the English have the place to themselves.
If during the service, after we've been round with the communion, anyone would like a laying on of hands for yourself or somebody else, then please would you ask for it when we get to that point. Don't be afraid to.
Joining an impromptu communion, I was reminded of days in school chapel when I furtively refrained from bowing my head at the mention of Jesus Christ, hoping, like many Jews before Israel lent muscle to our image, not to be caught in the act of being different. When the sun sets, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre has to be locked up. The question is, what group among the competing and mutually suspicious varieties of Christianity is going to be in charge of the key? Ironically enough, the key has been in the reliable hands of a Muslim family for many generations. The Arabs had seized it from the Crusaders, and when the Christians finally regained control, they left the key in the custody of the heathen, rather than wrestle with each other for its exclusive control, as they surely would have. Every Friday at 3 p.m. sharp, Franciscan monks lead a parade of reverent tourists along the Via Dolorosa, in the Arab quarter of the Old City. In Jerusalem, one God's worshippers flow in and around another's, and another's. The Catholics will tell you that Jesus took this sad road to his crucifixion, but archaeologists are not so sure. Still, what is truth if faith says otherwise? For me, the Holocaust is a greater calamity for man and God than the crucifixion. But that's a partial view, of course. The Jews had their crown of thorns at Auschwitz and Treblinka. The thorns went deeper, I sometimes think, than they did with Jesus, who does, after all, sit on the right hand of God. The ashes of European Jewry know no such resurrection. What is religion without its souvenir market? What is anything without a market, after all? The prophetic and the profitable often ride in tandem. One man's God is another man's idol. One man's faith is another man's madness. Luckily, most of us don't have to make the distinction. But if you're a psychiatrist in Jerusalem treating dozens of wannabe messiahs every year, that's exactly what your clinical duty is.
How do you distinguish between sane and insane religious beliefs?
Our problem in a lot of cases is the not clear-cut boundaries between a person with a deep conviction, perhaps bizarre, and real mental ill disease. If a person said today that he can walk on the water, or they can make from one piece of bread a complete dinner or something like this, in a very strictly psychiatric point of view, you say these people are not normal.
Are there messiahs in Jerusalem at the moment, people who say they are the messiah?
All the time we have messiahs. Oh. And we have here now, in Shaul Hospital, two messiahs from Israel. One is a very clear mentally ill person. The second we don't know because it's only from yesterday.
Old Jerusalem seems immune to time. This is the gate from which a Jew called Saul set out for Damascus. On the road, a blinding light inspired him to become St. Paul, who turned the unique God of the Jews into just 1/3 of the Christian Trinity. Meanwhile, did not yet have the militant faith which Muhammad taught them 600 years later. Almost 2,000 years after St. Paul, Arab East Jerusalem still feels like an occupied city. Whether Jehovah is looking down at all this with vindicated satisfaction, or Allah in slow fury, who is to say?
Is Allah interested in politics? Does he have political views? You're not offended?
If Allah is interested in politics, no, I don't believe Allah is interested in politics.
Well, this leads to another question.
But I have to explain what I mean because that will put me in trouble with some people who may not understand what I mean. If we use the Holy Quran, if we read the Holy Quran, or if we read the Hadith of Prophet Muhammad, Allah is interested in justice. Allah is interested in fairness. Allah is interested in having people come to know Him. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam comes from the one source, from heavens, from the one who sits on the throne above the 7 heavens, from the Almighty Allah. Should you want to call Him God, it's fine, but He is the one, the same one. If you believe in the Day of Judgment, if you believe in the heavens of God, if you believe in God Himself, then whether you are a Jew or a Christian, you are a Muslim, because you are a submitter.
Is this submission to a God who does things in the world or allows things to happen in the world, or what?
Both.
Why does He allow hatreds to exist in the world?
I don't believe that Allah allows hatred. I believe that man is created in such a manner that he always has an alternative. You can hate and you can love. You can do good deeds and you can do bad deeds. You can believe and you can disbelieve.
Is the the problem which divides this city spiritually? A problem of a clash of theologies, of gods, or a clash of politics masquerading as a clash of gods?
I think the last one. I think it's a clash of politics. If I'm praying in my beautiful and dear mosque, and 100 or 200 meters to the west of where I'm praying, a Jew is praying to the same God, is he going to disturb me? The answer is no. Now I say to my Jewish neighbor, give me a break, for God's sake. I have people. I have traditions. I have history.
You can't blame Muslims for feeling aggrieved. The Dome of the Rock is, after all, a sacred place. But it was built on the rubble of Solomon's temple, and it was designed as palpable, if beautiful, evidence of Arab conquest of what had been a Jewish and Christian city. What's curious is how different religions often have similar validating miracles and mythologies and holy places. The dome covers the rock from which the Prophet Muhammad, like Elijah and Jesus before him, ascended into heaven. Zionist myth insisted that Palestine was a land without a people for a people without a land. But that was to reckon without the Arabs. In the Middle East, a site need not be old to be symbolic, or a bone of savage contention. Even building a so-called suburb of Jerusalem on a God-forsaken hillside like Har Homar has become a symbol of Israeli self-assertion, a deep wound in the flank of what had long been Arab territory, even though no one actually lived there. God-forsaken, not as Jews and Arabs see it. From the hilltop, you can see Bethlehem, once a peaceful little town. This is no new piece of religious architecture. It's armor plating to protect the tomb of Rachel, the wife of the patriarch Isaac. A Jewish shrine in an Arab town.
Thank you.
The Jews are the people of the book, and by God, there ain't much here but the book. Only Jews could build a tomb with its own library. This shrine has supposedly been here for thousands of years, but it looks oddly unfinished and certainly a bit charmless. Are these my sisters? Are these my brothers? They sound to me as if they're bidding in some kind of spiritual auction, vying for God's attention. Spinoza wrote, "It's ignoble to suppose that God intervenes in the affairs of mankind." Ignoble, or at the very least, risky. My Israeli guide took me deeper into the West Bank, to the ancient Arab city of Hebron, and another shrine, in the heart of an ultra-Zionist settlement.
So what does it say here?
So here is buried the saint, Dr. Baruch Goldstein, and so on. And then it says, gave his soul for the people of Israel, his Torah, and his land.
And do these people think that God approved of what he did?
Well, probably, if they call him a saint.
Yes.
In 1994, Dr. Baruch Goldstein machine-gunned Muslims at prayer in the mosque. 29 of them died. Yet Dr. Goldstein had once treated Jews and Arabs alike. Fanaticism banished neutrality. A healer made incurable the plague of mutual hatred in Hebron. The dusty square at the crossroads of Jewish-Arab enmity, where pilgrims come, or came, to see the tomb of the patriarch Abraham, common ancestor of Jew and Arab alike. The tomb may belong to both, but is a place of shared heritage and separate entrances, of bad neighbors and brotherly hate. Jews and Arabs must ascend to Abraham's tomb by different staircases and on different days. This was the only occasion I've ever been asked by a soldier, "Are you Jewish?" I said yes with a curious apprehension that there might be an ugly consequence. But the soldier was Jewish too, and there wasn't. Since the camera crew were Gentiles, I had to go on alone. Take it on trust. The crew had missed nothing worth losing their foreskins for. The mosque I couldn't go to, because I'm a Jew. Thanks to Dr. Goldstein, a thronging tourist attraction is now reduced to a deserted village, where few now choose to go, and where tension has evicted prosperity. To which God, and for what, does anyone give thanks for this? Perhaps we should ask the zealots who gather at sunset to dance and pray back at Goldstein's grave, the shrine of a mass murderer. One can only suppose that they live by a different clock and swear by a different God. It was only in about 1975 that God insisted that religious Zionist settlers implant themselves deep in Arab territory. This is Shiloh, said in the Bible to be where the Ark of the Covenant between Jehovah and the Israelites once rested. The Crusaders built their castles. The Jews have built a domed yeshiva, a place for settlers to be single and very narrow-minded defenders of territory to which they have no clear title.
If one is going to use the Bible as the source of one's leases of land, this is going to create, to say that these certain problems because different people have different holy books. Can there be another God for other people?
The one God that I believe in is the one God because there are many paths to him. The one God doesn't mean that there is only one belief. The one God means that there are many, many paths and that all paths lead to him.
Is Allah another God?
Allah, as far as I'm concerned, is a vision of the same God that I believe in.
A few days ago we visited Hebron, and we then went up to the settlement where there is, for want of a better term, a shrine to Dr. Goldstein, who shot 29 Arabs when they were praying. Now, could not a Palestinian argue that, as it were, their God has ample reason to doubt the propriety of a Jewish state? How does that one work?
First of all, a Palestinian could argue that, and if he did, I would completely understand it. But as far as I can tell, there's a difference between a number of actions that were taken by individual Jews and by an infrastructure, an organizational infrastructure, whose goal is terrorism, that is supported by a majority of the villagers in the villages that surround Shiloh.
But perhaps the surrounding people favor the action of the Arabs because they are Arabs. They regard the settlers as invasive interlopers with a Zionist infrastructure and backed by a very partisan God.
How does one reconcile a God who can acquiesce by his silence in the Holocaust and who then at some later stage, in particular the 67 war, pops up to redeem his promise to the people of Israel? Is the God that you envision the kind of God who might have had second thoughts?
God always has second thoughts. The experience that the Jews have had all the way through history, and what the Bible seems to continually come back to, is that there is an interrelationship between God speaking to the world and the world speaking back to God. And that, as the prophets described it, is in a sense a relationship similar to that of a husband and wife, who don't always live in marital bliss, but they always live with an image of marital bliss that is an underpinning to their daily squabbles.
Do you have second thoughts about certain things? Never mind, let's leave God to have his.
The first thing that you learn when you learn the Talmud as a religious text is that disagreement is the culture of this religion. The balance between certainty and doubt is nothing to run away from. It's nothing to strangle certainty because one has doubts, and it's nothing to strangle the creativity of the doubt because one lives with certain certainties.
The Crusader kingdoms of the Middle East are, like modern France and Britain, no longer of much consequence here. Only armies of tourists now disembark in the Holy Land to take it not by storm, but by char-a-banc. This is not just one more river. It's the River of Jordan, where John the Baptist made his name. Let's hear it, folks, for the reborn.
Bruce, Mary and Robert, we baptize you in the name of the Father and of the Son and the Holy Spirit.
The River Jordan is sacred to Christians, the Sea of Galilee too. For secular Israelis, it's more a riviera. The simplest way of accessing the Christian high spots of the Galilee was to pedal. So many miracles and so many churches to commemorate them. So many sermons and, unfortunately, so many mounts. I didn't notice an increase in my spirituality, least of all on the uphill bits. Religion entails restrictions. What you can eat and what you can't, what you wear and what you don't but should. Man is born naked as God presumably intended, but everywhere we see him and her invited not to shock the deity by too blatant a parade of his own creation.
Why is God so hung up about sex? Is he hung up about sex, or are we?
Sex is a powerful human experience. Religion is an attempt in many ways to come to an ordered life, all right?
Yes.
Bring a life that's meaningless and disordered and try to bring it into focus and meaning. Let's face it, one of the most unruly parts of the human psyche and the human body is the sexual drive.
You think that Paul's talk about the tongue being an unruly member was a displacement upwards in Freudian terms?
Well, yeah. I'm not even going to answer that one. You have to bring a Freudian in here to answer that. But I do think that the unruliness of the sexual passion is something that every religious person who takes self-control seriously has to deal with. I think that's why it's become a focus.
Think about all the things happened here. Most of his miracles performed here. More than any place else, 85% of the miracles.
To me, Capernaum's Greco-Roman architecture is a reminder of the pagan gods. But none of today's visitors cover their knees for Venus or bend them to Zeus. So was the existence of these defunct gods ever disproved? What hard evidence can we ever have of any god's existence?
I do think that it's impossible to prove logically anything about God or anything that pertains to faith, but I don't think that Christianity, at least, or any other religion for that matter, claims that all of its faith, its teachings, its practice, all of those things are based on logic. I mean, ultimately, when you look at what Christianity accepts, what its people believe, what they practice, it's based on an experience. And for Christianity, that experience would be, At the beginning of the Christian movement, people experienced this risen Christ.
I think one of the things which bothers those of us who are not religious is the pretension, if I can put it that way, to unique rightness. Do you think it's any part of the Christian faith to claim that it is uniquely right?
I think it's one thing to claim it's uniquely right, and another thing to say, accept this or else. Now, when you have a pluralistic world, which is what we have, you know, almost every space is a world space now. You have all these people from all these different cultures, religions, languages pushed together in one place. I love pluralistic cultures. It keeps you honest in your own tradition and forces you to come to some understanding of the others.
This century has been a century in which hostility to God has been exceptionally vigorous. Freud, as we know, wrote a book which he called The Future of an Illusion.
Yes.
And this illusion was man's constant faith in God.
Yes.
So how do you react to this notion of God having been, A, disparaged, and perhaps almost to the point of being about to disappear, and now at the end of the century, apparently having recovered a great deal of his vigor?
No one can tell me that Freud and all of these people, and Marx, who have leveled criticisms against religion, did not do religion a service. We needed to hear those criticisms. But the Russians have a statement I like very much. They say, religion is like a nail. The harder you hit it, the deeper it goes.
Akko, or Acre, Richard the Lionheart's HQ in what had been Arab-dominated country for centuries. Now Muslim boys swim in a harbour which once sheltered those who, in God's name, brought the sword, not peace, to the Holy Land. The Crusaders were assured that God would forgive them if they broke their word to the heathen Saracens. So the Christians reneged on promises and failed to observe truces. If holy advantage could be taken of Muslim good faith and credulity, then God help them. The West now often accuses Muslims of double-dealing, when Christianity, to the greater glory of its God, certainly dealt doubly with them. Some Arabs appear happy to wait patiently until the Jewish state withers away, just as the Crusader kingdoms did, for want of genuine roots. Time will tell, the Arabs say. Who knows whether it will or whether it won't, and what tale it will tell, and which gods it may finally honor. Not only Jews, Muslims, or Christians dispute or live in the narrow land of Israel. This is the world headquarters of the Baha'i, a multiracial sect founded in the 19th century by their prophet, a Persian noble called Baha'u'llah, himself a former Shiite mystic. His mission was to reconcile all the great monotheisms.
I'm not a Christian, but certainly Baha'is believe in Christ. I mean, we believe in the founders of all the major world religions.
What form does that belief take? I mean, do you believe that he's the Son of God?
I would believe that he is a messenger from God and that he brought a message for mankind, which was right for the age in which he came.
Is Allah also the same God? Does he have a place in your religion?
Well, we would believe that there is one God, and there are different ways of expressing God. There are different names you can give to God. But that God, in his essence, is unknowable.
One of the things really interesting about the Baha'i religion is that it is new. What are the advantages and disadvantages of novelty in a religion, do you think?
Well, I think one of the distinct advantages is that we have the written words of the prophet of our faith, which were written as and when he spoke them. And it's not distorted by man. It's the essence.
And what are the disadvantages of being a new religion? Are there any? A lack of antique sites?
Well, we have, this and again is really an advantage because it's only 100 years, just over 100 years ago that our founder passed away. So we know exactly where he had been. We know the houses that he lived in, and we visit those places, and we know for sure that they're authentic.
Are there rules about dress? Do people have to wear certain clothes?
No.
Do they have to eat certain foods?
No.
Do they have to not eat certain foods?
No.
Do women have to be segregated from men in ceremonies?
No.
Or?
No.
So
What do Baha'is disapprove of?
Well, there are a few don'ts.
Yes.
Drugs is one.
Yes.
Baha'is don't take drugs. They don't take alcohol. There aren't so many.
Do the Baha'is condemn anybody in terms of heresies or people that they regard as devils or people who...
No.
Do you think being so accepting and so generous is actually, in many ways, not what people want from religion? I mean, does it ever occur to you that, in a sense, absence of prejudice and malice may limit your numbers rather than increase them?
I don't think so. This is a new age. This is a time when people are looking for truth. And I think the faith has the answers for them if they investigate it.
There are old answers too, if you know where to look. Very old ones.
Rabbi Weinberg, what are all these young men doing here?
Well, very simple. You know, if you stumble on a gold mine, you stay there and you dig. Everybody's looking for the meaning of life, what the pleasure of life really is. You know, everybody knows that life is gorgeous, and it's such a hassle. It doesn't make sense.
So where are they digging?
In our heritage.
These born-again Jews are practicing pilpul, the cut and thrust of argument over biblical texts. The trick is not just reading the lines, but reading between them.
No, but this is a moral notion, isn't it? If I break your toy, I don't replace it with a broken toy. I replace it with a toy that is not broken.
But not a better toy. But not, for example, I mean, it's not on purpose.
No, that would not be the law. That would simply be an act of generosity.
Yeah, if you want to. Right, if you want
Yes,
to, whatever
yes,
you want.
yes,
You can give it.
But there's another sensible point here, actually, isn't there, as well, if I understand this correctly, which is, once you have stood on my crate of peaches, how am I ever going to prove to you that they were okay or not okay before? So it would be a prudent lawgiver who said, we cannot actually argue about whether they were Well, I don't know whether I've spent the afternoon with God. I don't really think I have, but I've spent it with his Jewish followers, very keen ones, who spend their whole lives arguing. And I have to say that I've had a really extraordinary and enjoyable afternoon. It's strange. And I think it's strange. It comes mainly from the fact that these yeshiva students really talk philosophy. They don't talk theology, because everything they're talking about is really quite small and instances which are very like legal instances. And thinking that I was going to be faced with a lot of extremely credulous and tiresome people who only thought one thought, which was that Orthodox Judaism was correct, I wasn't faced with that at all, because in a strange way, they weren't very involved with God, at least not this afternoon.
They were all male, though, and I'm sure they were united in thinking that God was too.
When I was born, the Israeli Postal Service had a telegram, a decorated telegram. There was one for boys, Mazal Tov Leuledet haben, Mazel Tov for the birth of your son, and there was one for girls, Bat Tchila Siman Yafeh Lebanim, girl first, good sign for boys later. Meaning, plumbing is working, everything's fine, you know what to do, now bring the real thing.
Yes. When you think of the God of the Jews, do you think of a male God?
Absolutely, yes.
And what's his view of women?
Well, basically we are the way to make genetic material, Jewish genetic material, move from one generation to another. I'm seen in my religion as a uterus that talks and walks, but the most important part about me is the uterus.
Why don't you just say no to this God and walk away from him?
My problem is not so much with God. My war is, and the anger is, with the religious establishment. The people who are self-appointed to interpret to us what God wants, and they are chauvinist bullies in Israel.
And is there any conceivable sense in which you can challenge the grammar of God, in the sense that his maleness can be diluted with femaleness? Is it conceivable that there could be a female God?
Yes, in Judaism, yes. And it's right there, built
so
into our religion.
So you think that the maleness of God is something which has been wished upon him rather than a necessary attribute?
Absolutely.
And is that why Moses was permitted to see the back side of God, but not the front, do you think?
This is one of the things we use. We say, from the back, we all look alike.
This is where you'd expect to find nice Jewish girls, doing their housewifely duty in the old submissive way.
This is Friday in the Jerusalem Central Market. Market forces at work, one of the great modern gods to which we all have to bow. But in fact, God has an influence even on market forces, because in about an hour and a half, the sun will set, and none of the food on display here can be sold again until Sunday. And the result is that the prices will fall. So you could say that God was taking care of those with good nerves who would wait till the last moment.
Risking giving offense to the Orthodox, I turned on the square-eyed god of the electronic faith, the god for whom one neither kneels nor stands.
Protect this rare red heifer from those who would harm her. I'm saying, kill the cow. David Landau is an Israeli newspaper editor. He warns that in the hands of fanatic Jews, this cow could trigger a religious war between Jews and Muslims. The state of Israel, which after all is still a secular state, has got to put a stop to this. In the Bible, in Numbers, there are instructions to slaughter and burn a red heifer, cover oneself with the ashes, an ancient purification ritual that enabled the biblical Jewish priests to go atop the Holy Temple Mount.
It sounded to me like the point at which respect for religious tradition meets mumbo-jumbo. This I really had to see.
So this is Slil, the red cow who, little does she know it, is supposedly destined to reenact a ritual that took place in the Bible, a ritual which one can hardly believe any modern god would really ask anyone to repeat, to slaughter the animal and to burn it and to smear the result on the faces of the warriors who are going to recapture the Temple Mount. Wittgenstein once said that if lions could speak, we wouldn't understand what they were saying. If this red heifer could speak, we wouldn't understand it any better, I suppose, but I think we might interpret what she said as, why me? Why indeed?
The idea of the red heifer and of preparing this perfect red cow for this concoction that's to be made when the temple is established seems a rather starry-eyed, naive, a little unrealistic, but I don't think it does anyone any harm, and I don't think the individuals need to be considered candidates for an asylum as a result of that. But if we put your red heifer aside for a moment, and let's take an aspect which is a normative aspect of ritual, and if you say, isn't there a danger that you become so obsessive with these areas that it distorts your overall perspective in relation to the rest of society? My answer again and again is yes. And I think that's a perfectly natural human response to that.
You're an Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah.
You don't surely seriously think that it's up to each individual Jew whether or not to produce a very clear instance, he has a bacon sandwich.
Of course it's up to him to do it. That's exactly what the Bible says. The Bible says in Deuteronomy, I have given you, says God, essentially the capacity of free choice. I haven't given you that in order not to be able to exercise it. I have given you good, I have given you evil, I have given you life, I have given you death. Make your choice. There are consequences to your actions, but you have to make the choice. If you're doing it because you have no choice, then what is the value of your action?
If you discover that members of your congregation drove to synagogue on a Saturday, you wouldn't just say, oh, well, if you feel like driving, drive, would you?
Of course not, because there I would say, if you are now seeking to be part of a particular community and of a particular tradition and of its values and of its ideals, then you should strive to improve your lifestyle in accordance with those aspirations of that particular tradition and heritage. You should. Driving on Sabbath is not the ideal. The ideal is to have a different kind of day, and I would try to explain what that day is all about so that the individual will be able to see its beauty, see the ideal, and voluntarily choose to live that way of life.
I wonder how much choosing there really can be in any Orthodox community, with all its pressures to conform. At their bar mitzvah, these Jewish boys become Jewish men. They make a choice which precludes further choosing, except at the cost of social ostracism. As soon as the pious of any faith are inside their piety, it is God who chooses them, for once and for all.
What's really extraordinary about this is that when you think about people who believe in God, you wonder how, after the Holocaust, they possibly can. And then again, standing here by the Wailing Wall and looking at these Jews doing something which at least imitates something that Jews have been doing for thousands of years, and the whole of Hitler's Reich has been blown away, you realize how they can believe that in spite of the death of 6 million Jews, God somehow, for whatever reason, sees them through and watches as the Assyrians and the Nazis disappear into oblivion.
God's last known address may well be Jerusalem, but my last destination had to be his first known address, amongst the rocks and sand of the Egyptian desert.
So how many gods have you found in Israel? Well, only the one, really. I was surprised at the convergence of the monotheisms. I expected them to be antagonistic, but they refused to be. And in fact, you realize that God was the first kind of spiritual single currency. And what have the gods of the Middle East got to do with you, then? Not as much as one might think, or maybe some people would hope. The answer is they seem a lot more foreign here than they do in England. One hears Arabic, one hears Hebrew, and one knows that one doesn't speak either. And the result is that God's reach seems not to be very great, although his intensity certainly bears down heavily, particularly on Jerusalem. And where are you off to now? Well, we're off to Mount Sinai, where Moses took delivery of the Ten Commandments, and where he also, owing to a gracious gesture, actually saw God. He only saw the backside of God, if I can put it that way, so the sex was indeterminate. I don't imagine that he'll be showing very much of himself to me, but one never knows. The top of Mount Sinai, where Moses met his God, and God, for their future joy and pain, chose the Jews. 1,000 miles from here, there was another mountain god. His name was Zeus, and he was born in Crete. Zeus agreed to have his picture everywhere. His sculptures were throughout the ancient world. This god told Moses that no image of him should appear. Zeus seemed to have all the publicity, but the God who started on this mountain knew better. I am that I am was all he said of himself, or allowed others to say. And today, he still is that he is, the God of the Jews and the Christians, and supposedly the creator and master of the world. He is here and everywhere, and Zeus is nowhere. The God of the Hebrews prevailed.
Somerset Maugham once wrote that the Orient allowed him to get down off his pedestal. But even Western travellers who lack a pedestal are confronted in the midst of Bangkok with a sense of their culture and morality being irrelevant. Bangkok means literally the City of Angels, but if any still actually live here, they're not of a kind we in the West would ever recognize, and they do not carry Christian messages. Thai taxi drivers certainly don't rely on St. Christopher. They trust to Providence, or to be more specific, the ancient principle of karma. Thailand is a vivid example of a non-Christian society which worships deities more various and, God knows, less jealous than our own. There is no celestial Mr. Big. The cross and the crescent have little place here. Buddha, however, is everywhere. Thailand is an intensely religious society, but it lacks a god head. The Buddha is honored with deep reverence at temples like Wat Po, but he is not and never will be a god. He created nothing except a new way of life and of seeing the world, setting an example that the pious Buddhist follows as the good Christian imitates Jesus. But his followers worship Buddha as the embodiment of a philosophy, not as the creator of mankind.
Every time I see the reclining Buddha, I have this same extraordinary feeling that it's one of those rare images which is bigger than the thing that contains it. It was said of the Zeus's Olympia, which was built by Phidias, it was a sitting figure, that if it stood up it would take the roof off. And with the reclining Buddha you have the same feeling of something which is so large that if it were to move, the whole world would somehow be split open. It's not a divine figure, and yet it has a kind of generosity and humor which makes one realize the smallness of the human condition, particularly when you stand literally beneath its feet.
Buddhism is a cult of the intellect, a philosophy, not a celebration or assertion of divinity. When he died, the Lord Buddha hoped not for divinity, but for nirvana, a state immune from desire. Buddha is actually a more practical example to man than any god can be. Jesus is, after all, inimitable. Even if Christians aspire to heaven, they can't hope to sit on the right hand of God. Buddha was merely an enlightened human being, something which, in theory at least, we can all be. I have an old friend in Bangkok called Paddy Dixon. He's a doctor who married a Thai and transplanted to Bangkok. I thought he might give me a primer in Buddhism for foreigners. After all, he was one himself once.
Paddy, how long have you been in Thailand?
40 years, about.
When I knew you at Cambridge, were you a Christian then?
I was a nominal Christian, you know. I always went to church on Sundays because everybody else did. I was fed Christianity from a young age and accepted it like a sponge. And rather more, I'd never really been happy about asking God for anything. Give us this day our daily bread. I'd never been very... I always thought that people were always going to pray to God that this will happen, or pray to God that that won't happen, or pray for this and pray for that. And I thought, poor old God, really, all these people asking him for something all the time. It's not on. It's rather bad form.
What have you become since then?
Well, I think it's true to say that I have become Buddhist since then. Buddha never claimed to be God or a God. All he claimed was that he'd thought about life very much. And the big thing that he discovered, the real reason that people are unhappy in this world is because of desire. Desire for this, that, the other, whatever. That because of desire. And if only you could conquer desire, you would then be very happy.
What about your future progress as a spirit or as a soul? Do you believe in that, or are you just happy to leave that to whatever happens to be the case?
I'm a strong believer that this is just a phase, and that when we die, our soul will move on to the next phase. I personally think it's very likely that there may be some sort of circular thing about it, that we may come back again. I think that that is as likely as a lot of other things, that I might float up onto a cloud and play a harp.
Buddhists wait with patient anxiety for what will befall them in the next life. They may return as a nobler, luckier person, or through having behaved badly as a dog, or perhaps a pigeon. The concept of merit is the fuel and the lubricant of Buddhist reincarnation. To better yourself by meritorious acts is both a good thing and a kind of next life insurance. The merit is to be made by feeding the monks, who early in the morning line up, at once humble and demanding, for handouts. The pious distribute largesse as widely and meritoriously as possible. There's no call to do good by stealth here. If you've got arms, flaunt them. Those who can't find time to prepare something at home can pick up a pre-packed offering.
Are these buckets a form of cheating, really, on the part of people who give them to the monks? I mean,
They're a bit of a shortcut out there. I mean, if you're giving a gift, it's nice to select a gift and give it. This is a sort of ready-made token gift.
This is the Fortnum's Handbook for ascetics, is it?
Well, this is a set of things, all useful for the monks.
Ovaltine seems a bit fancy for the simple life, doesn't it?
They're allowed to have a drink after midday, and nothing to eat after midday, but they can drink. And they do, I think, get hungry, and so they have a little Ovaltine or something.
Monks are only human after all. Ovaltine and not ambrosia suits them fine. The lives of Thai people do have space for gods as well, but not exactly as we know them.
We in the West tend to think of God as a singular being, and therefore, rather fortunately, omnipotent and taking care of everything himself. A jealous God who does not like other gods.
Yes. Here, when Buddhism came to Thailand, animism was here already. Buddhism took in animism within its own embrace, as long as it doesn't contradict with the major or the main concept of Buddhism. We took in all the gods, all the local gods, we took them in also. We talk about gods, small g, and with s, plural. Like at this pavilion, I believe that there is God of this pavilion, a spirit that protects. I kind of spoke to him or to her, asking for permission for me to, well, with the film crews, we'll be working here for some time, I hope you don't mind. That kind of speech, I had with the spirit, with the gods, before we start the film.
But do you really think that the spirit could do us any harm in this interview?
Yes. Suppose if we come with, being very rude, start shouting and then you walk around, the kind of thing that the spirit could do to us is that your camera wouldn't work, the script has gone wrong, you don't ask the right question, I don't answer the right question. That kind of thing. It starts raining all of a sudden.
You talked of the god of this pavilion. The god of this pavilion, I take it, will not also be at the hotel. In other words, they are very localized. Is this like the gods which the animists build their spirit houses for?
Yes, same idea.
You have to look after it, to let the spirits above know that we're thinking about them. And we give them bits of food,
I noticed,
which I think the birds probably benefit from mostly, but we like to think the spirits had first go at them if they wanted to, you see. And we hang these little garlands of flowers on the...
Regularly or on special occasions or what?
Both.
Right.
Often if, I think that something's going wrong, if the roof's leaking or something like that, and I think, well, it's rather a long time since I looked after the spirits. I better go and see how they are. Here, we'll put it on the corner here.
Are these gods, these spirits?
No, spirits.
No.
They're just spirits?
They're angels of lower levels.
Okay.
Yes. They're rather irresponsible.
So they're,
really.
they're like nymphs and things.
Nymphs and shepherds come away.
Right. Thought you might say.
Yes.
Thailand means literally the land of the free. Unlike neighboring Burma and Cambodia, the Thais were never conquered by a foreign power, least of all a Western one. Thai Buddhism has not been invaded by Islam or compromised by Christianity, yet Thailand has manifestly not escaped foreign influence. Buddha himself emerged from the Indian Hindu tradition, which has a panoply of gods to rival the ancient Greeks. While Hindu gods are surplus to the strictly orthodox Buddhist requirements, they are not unwelcome in Bangkok. The Greeks burned their animal sacrifices, believing that the smoke would rise to Mount Olympus, where the gods could inhale their refreshment. The Brahmins at this Hindu temple are vegetarians. They burn saris, not heifers, for a goddess who is at least as fashion-conscious as her devotees. Fire is hungry and may be divine, and is fed with spices as well as raiment, for the delectation and appeasement of the gods. Amongst the fast food eateries across town, a different tribute to another Hindu deity.
Right here in downtown Bangkok, there's a sort of human jukebox, which is in fact a shrine to Brahma, the god who likes dancing girls. And so right opposite Planet Hollywood, which is the newest and most powerful mythology, one which sweeps the whole of the world, is one of the oldest mythologies. I suppose a version of temple prostitution, though a very decorous one in this case, in which you pay so much money in order to get these girls to dance with so much talent. Dances which once upon a time captivated the god and now entertain the devout people who come here for a sort of fast prayer bar, I suppose you could say. They seem to work with great speed. They buy whatever they need in the way of flowers or joss sticks, bung them in, quick prayer, and on they go.
Even inside the royal Thai palace, the cloisters are filled with scenes from the Hindu mythology of the Ramayana, officially quite outside the Buddhist canon. Still, Western religious art is lavish with references to the Greco-Roman mythology, which Christianity claims to have rendered obsolete and even sacrilegious. Perhaps man likes to remind himself of what he's lost as well as gained in the name of religious progress. The kings of Thailand traditionally take the Hindu name of Rama, just as many kings of France were called Louis in honor of the saint, but they at least shared his Catholic faith. On the highest pedestal of all sits the really quite tiny figure of the Emerald Buddha. Actually made of jade, not emerald, it's the most sacred icon of Thai Buddhism, as near a divine image as a non-divinity can get. It's also the evergreen symbol of national unity.
In Thai society, we are Buddhist by birth. When we are grow up, we learn the goodness of the Buddha. We can say that the Buddhism and the Thai nationality are the same.
Now, what about the question of believing in God or in gods? Is that something different?
In Buddhism, there are many, many gods. Maybe millions of gods, but not in the sense that they create the universe, they create the man and animal, they control us. But we believe God, the God in the sense that they are live in the heaven. Some God also stay on the earth, on the mountain. We and God have the same destination. We are bird, we are getting old, we are die.
Yes.
So that we and God are the friends of each other. But
gods do die then?
Yes, the God is disappear.
And is reborn?
Reborn again. Depend
can he go up or down?
Yeah. Up and down, depend that what the karma or the action we perform during in their life.
And this is true of men?
Yeah.
But can men become gods?
Yes, of course.
Can.
Yeah, they can.
But that's not a very important thing to be.
That's not important, yes. We don't care much about the God, what the God thinking, or when we perform good and bad action, have nothing to do with the God.
Since Thai society has changed enormously, as we see particularly in Bangkok, yes. Buddhism surely cannot make that go back to what it was before.
In this state, I think maybe no way to back to the former Thai society, that agricultural society. Everybody want the big car, big house, want big money. That's the problem.
There may be no official gods in Thailand, but Mammon has plenty of temples. The Siam National Bank borrows its sense of scale from the great halls and shrines of Buddhism. Asia's religious belief in the omnipotence of economic growth has taken a knock recently, but the temple still stands. The priests and priestesses of profit go to lunch under the at least semi-divine eye of the King and Queen of Thailand. Even here, the iconography of the Ramayana myths graces materialism with the lineaments of the spiritual. The bank's murals borrow their grandeur from the royal temple and were executed by a painter whose kudos comes from his sacred style. And cosseted among the vignettes of traditional Thai life, the bank's modern logo. Greenpeace is the painted ship upon this painted ocean, a tribute to ecology in one of the pollution capitals of the world. Would Giotto or Michelangelo do commercials if they lived today? They might draw the line at McDonald's. But the very same muralist from the bank also immortalized Ronald McDonald in a style normally reserved for dealing with something bigger even than a Big Mac, if that's not sacrilegious to imagine. The Thais are unsentimental about the past, perhaps because it is past. For Buddhists, the wheel of existence keeps turning, and the great cycle of life will, after all, bring the past back in due time. For Thais, history is in the future, so why retrieve it now? I hadn't the luxury of waiting time, so I set out from Bangkok to the old summer palace at Bang Pa Inn. The palace monastery is on an island and seemingly populated exclusively by children, albeit holy ones.
East is east and west is west. And architecturally, this is one of the places where they meet. This building is a tribute, I suppose, to Victorian suburban church architecture of the kind that John Betjeman admired. And it was constructed at the order of Rama V, the king of Siam, who brought the English governess to look after his children, little knowing that he would be in a musical much later. To the outside eye, it looks exactly like the sort of church which you would find in Brondesbury Park or Tooting. When you go inside, there's something of a surprise.
The figure on the altar may look like a Western import, but that's Buddha, not Jesus, on a pedestal. Until King Rama V in the mid-19th century, you could say that the Thai god was not in the heavens, but in the royal palace. The king was treated as a divinity. The royal family were literally untouchable, with tragic consequences. When the boat containing Rama's queen and her children capsized in the river, no servant dared lend them a hand. It was against the law to touch a living god. The old idea of the divine monarchy drowned with the queen and one of the princesses. Perhaps the river gods had not been sufficiently assuaged.
T.S. Eliot once said about the Mississippi that he didn't know much about gods, but he thought the river was a strong brown god. This is a pretty strong god too, but it's more kind of dirty grey colour. I don't know whether the Buddhists revere the gods of rivers like the Greeks did. They have ample cause to, though, because this is where their riches partly come from. So I imagine they do.
Under the aegis of Mammon, one oriental skyline is getting to look very like another. Kuala Lumpur is only a short flight from Bangkok, but for Malays, Allah, not Buddha, presides. Allah and his more mundane Malaysian deputy, economic progress. The city shows all the recognized architectural signs of modernity, tempered with Islamic traces. The Asian obsession with novelty, decorated with Islamic motifs, unchanged for centuries.
At first sight, this isn't really the image of an Islamic society that I might have expected. If you look at this picture, you can see that there's a huge minaret there, which looks like something on a mosque, but in fact I suspect is to do with telecommunications. And on the other side, you've got a sort of enormous hairdryer pointed at the moon, which again suggests an interest in other worlds, rather foreign to the retroactive Islamic societies of the Middle East. As far as the fundamentalist Islamic societies of the Middle East are concerned, you could well say that the past is there. The future, apparently, is here.
Chinese, Indians, Thais, and of course native Malays make up the varied population of Malaysia. There are many religions, and their respective gods all seem to rub along together just fine. But it's Allah who supplies the structure of the country's society. Despite the breadth of religious culture represented here, the ethnic Malays are the majority, and Malays are Muslim. Officially, at least, Allah is the boss. In other parts of the world, Islam is often the partner of stagnation. But for an avowedly Muslim country, Malaysia has done remarkably well in the modern world. Perhaps it's only pure, uncompromised Islam which leads to social paralysis. But even in Malaysia, everything still stops at prayer time. The fabric and design of the National Mosque may be airport modern, the religious message it enshrines can never change. The theological score is, and will ever be, Allah one, the rest nil. Pious Malays do not assemble in the spirit of inquiry, still less of doubt. Rather, they step away for a few minutes from the unknowns of westernization and retreat into the known, the tried, and the tested. The law and the word of Allah. The Greeks had their oracle at Delphi. The Chinese of Kuala Lumpur can come here to find out what the future holds. These ethnic Chinese Malaysians are having a birthday party for a whiskery god. They know it's the right day because this god was once a man, a Chinese general who lived in the Third Kingdom. In honor of his intimidating wisdom and bravery, banquets are prepared, joss sticks are lit, and symbols are clashed. Unlike Thai Buddhists, these petitioners do not feel that they themselves have much control over their own fortunes. Buddhists can earn merit and derive hope from it of a better life. The Taoists, like Westerners, are more at the mercy of the gods.
Am I right in thinking that in Taoism there is no great interest in God in the Christian sense or in gods in the Hindu sense?
In the Taoist philosophy, there's no one God. But in the actual practice of Taoism as a ritualistic belief system with its own rituals, they believe in one God. And that person, they consider to be Lao Tzu, who is the person who wrote the book, The Way of the Tao. And that is a historical figure. And those who believe in Taoism religion claim that it was under inspiration of God that that particular book was written.
But he is not himself a god.
Lao Tzu 本身不是一个神，不是 He himself is not God. Because God don't need inspiration. God
Very
is like
good.
God.
Okay. Very good. Are you a Taoist yourself?
I am a combination of Taoism, Buddhism, Confucianism, and I'm also a product of the Christian education, someone that is living in a Muslim cultural world.
So you're almost as big a mess as I am, I know.
No, I can't speak on your behalf. I'm not in a mess.
I'm very interested in the notion of this temple being some kind of an oracle.
Hey, are you game? Seriously, if you don't have to tell what you wish, you do for a wish, then he'll tell you how to proceed with the ritual.
Is that possible?
Yes, yes.
Well, then let's do it.
Yeah. The first bamboo stick that dropped out will have a number to that, and then that will represent it. It doesn't matter, he can repeat the whole thing again.
Even here there are skills one
That's
doesn't
right,
have.
because the local people are so used to it.
There's only one left.
You notice that, cannot, it's not counted. It should be the one that dropped out.
Doesn't matter which way out they are.
No, it doesn't matter.
Across town, the general's birthday party continues. Taoists do not simply hope or trust in the attentions of heaven. Leaving nothing to chance, their drums are designed to wake the gods. After all, if you're going to burn a palace and a stable full of horses, you do want the divinity's full attention. Fire, so often the vehicle of worship, the conduit between man and God. But in a tropical climate like Malaysia's, rain is often more prevalent than flames. There's a large Chinese Buddhist constituency in Malaysia, but their version has different livery to the Thai. Even the Lord Buddha himself looks unfamiliar, more Chinese, really. There are distinct ancillary Chinese gods as well, whose wrath is more explicit. They have a more vindictive air than the smiling Lord Buddha ever did. About 10% of Malaysians are ethnic Indians, transplanted from southern India as cheap labor by the British colonial authorities. They simply brought their gods with them and still honor them in a cave just outside Kuala Lumpur.
In any number of myths, the earth is said to be the house of God. It's not just churches and temples that are said to be that, but in fact the whole of the earth. And when you visit caves like this, you can well see where that kind of myth came from. If gods don't inhabit caverns, they inhabit mountaintops. It would be convenient and Freudian to suppose that gods were on the mountains and that goddesses were in caverns. It's not quite true, even though in fact oracles and priestesses who give the word of God tend to loiter in dark places. This is pretty well lit, and as one of the rooms in God's houses goes, it's pretty impressive. And it has this magnificent chimney which leads straight up to the heavens.
While what appears to be the goddess of Swiss army knives looks on, the curious can explore a kind of Madame Tussauds of the divine.
You have Lord Brahma, who is the creator, and you have Lord Vishnu, who is the preserver, and then we have Lord Shiva, who is the destroyer. And these are the three gods that form the main trinity. Then, of course, on the other side, we have Mahavishnu and Lakshmi, the goddess of wealth.
And these gods are immortal, they have lived forever and will live forever?
Yes, the goddess, they have no end and no beginning and no end.
But they also have children, don't they? They have descendants.
The idea of these children and the family and all is to make the layman or the common people to understand and appreciate the concept of God.
And this is the Rama saga, in effect, enables them to relate divinities to ordinary life.
That's right, yes.
And are there local gods in southern India which you would not find in northern, or in Malaysia that you would not find in either of those places?
The same gods will take different names, and they come in different forms. So the duplication of names is there. You can't. I mean, there's many places.
Yeah, so this is echoed in Greek mythology, where you have local Dionysus or local Aphrodite who are slightly different.
If you make a comparison, there's so much of parallel between Greek mythology and Hindu mythology. There's no running away from it.
Do Hindus sometimes have their own choice of God, or does God sometimes choose a Hindu in some way? How do you read that?
No, the people have the choice of their gods.
The gods don't choose them.
The gods don't choose them.
They're not interested in that.
No, I wouldn't say that. But the fact that a God, is able to make a person come to him means that God has given him the blessing to be his devotee. You see? Hinduism, I notice, is a highly democratic religion.
Yes.
They don't try to convert. They don't try to say you must be here. Nothing. This is left to the individual to think for himself.
Not all gods are so permissive. Striking out into the jungles of Malaysia, one expects the exotic, and sometimes finds the familiar. The indigenous people of the Malaysian peninsula are known as the Orang Asli, the original people. But the original beliefs of many indigenous tribes have been left behind. the Methodists converted this particular village, and now they line up to rehearse the Christian creed and fight the good fight. Today is a christening, an initiation into a foreign way of life and belief, a baptism a world away from the waters of the River Jordan.
Ale Jesus kikawal sangin aja kilta itek uki berkat ka baptis Christian punan adalah kerja ru ajar hak nu Allah. Okay, mau imuh sangin ada.
Moren.
Okay. Ein baptis samoren he ko katuh muh menu ruklok sante.
As another child moves closer to Jesus, the villagers move further away from their cultural and religious heritage. Introduction to a new God can spell divorce from the old. Better the devil you know, goes the saying. But what about the God?
How long have you been a Christian yourself?
Since 1962.
And what were you before that?
Animists believe in different spirits, powerful spirit and less powerful spirit. And
are these of ancestors?
Some from ancestors, some from the spirit give dreams before becoming Christian. Our whole life controlled by the fear, and we always guided by the dreams.
Right. So are they now not afraid?
Now, no. Formerly, yes, very afraid.
Perhaps the villagers are happier now they've found someone to pray to. But they didn't fall into the arms of Jesus. They were pushed.
Well, I suppose about 200 years ago, this area had many gods, and they seemed really to function quite well until then. Why did they need the Christian God?
I think those of us who are Christians, first of all, have experienced God's wonderful love. And not all religions have a message of love, of forgiveness, and grace and mercy.
Christianity has brought to this part of the world a sense of sin. Are you altogether happy about telling people that certain things which they've always done perfectly happily have become sin?
Most of the things that Christians brought were already acknowledged as sins, like greed, pride, murder, adultery. I think the difference is that the God and Father of our Lord Jesus sent him to bring a message of forgiveness, a message of grace, and that there is nothing that we can do to earn our salvation or God's forgiveness. It's a free gift through the sacrificial death of Jesus on the cross. There is hope for everyone that if they will repent and trust, then there is forgiveness, a new relationship with God.
And if not?
If you do not respond, then you will perish.
Well, that's a pretty tough alternative, isn't it?
It is if you don't see that the offer, first of all, was a free gift.
Now, out here, there are many gods, and they may war with each other. They may even try to kill each other. They may live and they may also die, unlike the monotheistic gods. But they do seem to live and let live to a great extent. Do you think that Christianity has to cohabit with other religions and accept their insights?
When I look at other religions, I respect their sincerity and I respect their integrity. But because I have come to know Jesus as a living person and a Savior, and what I read in the Bible becomes a reality in my life, then I have to say that what Jesus claimed is true, that he is the way to the Father. And if you come to trust in him, you come to know God as he is. And that sets Christianity apart from all other religions.
Christian soldiers would find few recruits in Kelantan, the most Muslim state in Malaysia. In the state capital of Kota Baru, Islam is far too robust and self-assured for its followers to hear the call of Jesus Christ. There is no market for Jehovah here. But Islam too was once an import. It was carried here by Arab traders and exchanged for spices, timber, and silks. The locals were impressed that the Muslim Arab traders always kept their word, so the Malay sultans bought their gods as well as their goods. Once the local sultans were converted, the people followed, and while Malays are natural traders, they seem unlikely ever to swap their adherence to Islam.
We got Muslim go to pray. Close 30 minutes. Business close 30 minutes together.
Suddenly we seem to be in a state of flight from all commerce, and everyone is on their way to prayer, so I guess I better get out of here, because they're going to shut the cafe, believe it or not.
After the Almighty has been fed with his nightly tributes, his followers are free to eat again and again. Although the small coastal villages of Kelantan also belong just as firmly to Allah, there are still faint traces of the gods and spirits whom he replaced. Many of the villages have a bomo, a kind of Malaysian medicine man.
Yalah, jenis bomo ni banyak cara juga lah boleh buatnya. Banyak care bahasa kena luar pada penyakit. Apa ni penyakit Tuhan bui lah kita kata ada. Jadi penyakit makhluk bui sebaliknya. Bila makhluk diancamkan buat kerenak kepada manusia itu, maka kenalah orang tu. Jadi Pak Nik tu hak sekala Pak Nik boleh pisah lah. Memang Pak Nik sebenarnya itu mengikut dasar Tuhan juga. Pak Nik bergantung kepada Tuhan. Sebab Pak Nik duduk bayan bila Pak Nik di berkat. Kita kata tak, seorang bomo ni berkat, rahmat Tuhan beri ya. Jadi kita syukur alhamdulillah lah pemberian Tuhan kepada yang bomo kita ni. Sematiasa pun betul-betul Pak Nik menghadapi kepada Tuhan, dia percaya kepada Tuhan, walaupun Pak Nik berasa lebih, Pak Nik khabar lah. Kalau Pak Nik berasa lebih pun inilah ada pemberian Tuhan.
Like an exotic curate and speaking in the local dialect, the bomo's assistant begins the evening's proceedings. Before any treatment or consorting with spirits can begin, a gesture of obeisance to the Almighty Allah. The patient is an old man suffering from undiagnosed ills. The cure supposedly lies in the hands of these men. As the ritual quickens, the thick applique of imported monotheism begins to curl at the edges, giving an inkling of a more ancient religious culture. If the patient is to be cured, man must intervene where Allah cannot or will not. If the Prophet Muhammad would accept that these villagers are Muslims like any other, then Islam is a much broader church than we've ever been led to believe.
Well, you've looked very interested and quizzical, but you haven't told us what you really think about the gods and religions of Southeast Asia, have you? Well, I think it's a good idea to be interested and learn something before one starts passing opinions. Even now, I think they're a great deal more interesting than I had imagined before, but I'm not about to judge them. Can you really see yourself believing in or embracing any of the religions or faiths you've come across? Well, I think the problem there is that these are not faiths chosen individually from some kind of spiritual boutique. They nearly all of them belong to communities, and since I don't belong to those communities, I can't seriously imagine myself suddenly seeking to acquire those beliefs.
Two weeks in the Far East is only enough time to get a flavor of the range of gods and non-gods on offer.
I suppose all my thinking is coloured, in a sense, by a residual and pretty firm belief that it is unwise to think that God is going to intervene if one prays to him or if one believes in him. The events of the world are not of a kind which makes one think that going to fortune tellers or appealing to specific images is going to change the fate of man. And one's vision of this place is that of a curious tourist who doesn't want to fall into the old trap of thinking that people who are inscrutable are wise. I'm reminded of an old story of the man who went to visit a guru in the mountains of Nepal and spent 14 years preparing himself for the great meeting with the man who was going to tell him what the meaning of life was. And when eventually, after this arduous initiation, the man was finally admitted to the master, he said to the master, "Master, tell me, what is the meaning of life?" And the master said, "Life is a fountain." And the pupil said, "Life is a fountain?" And the master said, "Life isn't a fountain?"
Nothing seems more natural than nature. Landscape, we like to think, has no religion. But would Spain look as it does here in Andalusia if these fields had not first been irrigated under the aegis of Allah and then left dusty by their Catholic conquerors? Semana Santa in Sevilla. These marches are a mixture of arrogant penitence and shuffling triumphalism. What could be more threateningly humble than Spanish Catholicism? Spaniards often boast of the Christian purity of their blood, but they know how much their glory owes to the mixed blood they deny. Celebration and menace go together in Holy Week. The marchers make themselves tall and more or less anonymous in the unnerving uniforms of the Holy Inquisition. Their hooded costumes remind us of the Ku Klux Klan, who, in the southern United States, don them to terrorize blacks, Jews, and Catholics. Man is both inventive and repetitious when he comes to parade his pieties and his malevolence.
I'm now standing on the same bridge that I was looking down at about 5 hours ago, and these are the same people driven with the same kind of energy that they were driven with then. I'm flagging, but they're not. And I suppose the reason has to be that something or other in them makes them believe that what they're doing is valid. And that same thing makes me feel quite alarmed.
These people are actually celebrating one of the most intolerant, vindictive, and self-righteous organizations that you could imagine in 100 nightmares. If God really inhabited them in the way that they believe he inhabited their ancestors, I suppose I would be pretending to be a Christian, or running for my life, or being burnt at the stake. The Alhambra in Granada, one of the great capital cities of Spanish Islam. Government offices, fortress, pleasure dome, the palace was built, so they say, by a Jew. When the last of the Nasrid sultans was forced out of his beloved Court of the Lions in 1492, Spanish imperialism stamped its conquering mark on the plaster. If you've got it, flaunt it. The slogan of all Arrivistes. In this newly acquired palace, Ferdinand and Isabella received Columbus and commissioned him to discover a new world and acquire a new Spain. One conquest led eventually to another. Man and his God have similar greeds.
I don't know what the lure of the Alhambra is exactly. It's a great piece of crusading loot, of course, taken by the Christians from the Moors, and I suppose that the people who come here see it as some kind of proof of the superiority of Christianity, or maybe the superiority of Islam. I'm not sure. I'm not sure what I think myself, actually. I've been here about 10 times in my life, and I'm sure I shall come back, and sometimes I'm the Sultan, but I'm rarely a crusader. Often some kind of Jew, I suppose. Whatever it is, it has this kind of place of pilgrimage lure to it. And I guess more people come here now than ever came in its great days. Odd.
In Moorish Granada, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are said to have cohabited in harmony, the so-called conviviencia, the living together. Just how harmonious it really was is open to question. There's no such debate about the state of interfaith relations in modern Cordoba. This was once Corduba, a great Roman city. It's been built, rebuilt, and especially overbuilt. A Visigothic church replaced the Roman temple, then a great mosque, the church, and then, finally perhaps, a Christian cathedral swamped and partially digested the mosque. Catholicism is not wholly at ease here. It asserts itself too insistently, almost ludicrously, in what is only too obviously and beautifully a mosque, even if Muslims are forbidden to pray here. Jews with television cameras, it soon transpires, may walk, but not talk. The security men are more like insecurity men, on the watch not for thieves, but for the rightful owners of the place. Symbols of the clash of faiths and architectural styles abound. The mihrab, the Muslim preacher's pulpit, is chained off. Allah, you might say, has become the god in the iron mask. UNESCO has reproached the Vatican for its vandalizing Christianization of the place, but the thought police told us that we were not allowed to mention such things in the mosque, in the cathedral, I should say.
Well, the guides can talk, and I suppose the word of God can be heard for those who have ears for it, and the stones speak, but I, in principle, don't, because I'm forbidden to do so. So I suppose, apart from mutter mutter, I'd better say no more.
Andalusians have eradicated their origins, but the old roots are bearing improbable new fruit. Abdur Rahman Jimenez, from a Christian family with Jewish elements, is one of several new conversions, or should we say reversions, to Islam.
You have here in Cordoba one of the great monuments of struggle between the great religions in the mezquita. Are you ever tempted to go in there and pray?
Well, in fact, we cannot enter to pray in this mosque. It's a symbol of our past, and it's a very important monument, but we cannot pray there. I don't know why.
What happened in your vision of life that made you believe that Allah was the one God that you wished to honor, as opposed to the Christian God? Is he a different God or the same God in a different light?
Well, it's a very complicated question, you know. In fact, you know, the Muslim people, we believe that, you know, the three main religions have the same origins, you know. The three, they believe in God, but which are the difference, you know? Muslim people, they believe in the Tawheed. The Tawheed is the unification of God. We say that the God is one.
But so do the Jews, do they not?
Yeah. Also, but the Christian people, especially Catholic people, they speak about the Trinity, you know? And this is, for us, more complicated, you know? And also, when the Christian people feeling or thinking God, they make a lot of corporations.
They put bodies to
They put the bodies
God,
and God,
yes.
and this is very strange for the Muslim mentality. The difference between Islam and other religions for us is that Islam is the last religion, you know, and it's more fresh.
Jews played their part in Cordoba's past glory. The great Rabbi Maimonides has a hotel named after him. But in the little synagogue where he worshipped, Jews may no longer pray.
Voila. Little synagogue in Cordoba is one of the places I remember very well because I came here about 43 years ago first. And there was an old boy here, and he was the guide. He had one tooth, and he said, Antigua Sinagoga Hebraica, Monumento Nacional. And this is all there is, the old Jewish synagogue, a national monument. Simple little place with a sort of harem for the women upstairs. A lovely contrast with the ornateness of the Catholic faith.
The Moorish motif is no surprise in a time where Arabic was the language of art and science. Catholicism triumphed in Spain. It expelled both Islam and Judaism. But there is one great Mediterranean religion which it's been forced to accommodate. Live and let die is the motto of the bullfight. Blood and sand now draw bigger and more fervent congregations to the plazas de toros than most churches. One of the high priests of tauromaquia is Pedro Romero de Solis.
Los católicos consideramos que el acto religioso más importante, que es la misa, es la Sagrada Misa, donde se celebra y se conmemora la muerte de Cristo. En el momento de la consagración se separa la hostia, que es pan, que es carne, del vino, que es la sangre. Y la separación de la carne y de la sangre es justamente el símbolo de la muerte.
En la tauromaquia?
En la tauromaquia exactamente igual. Nosotros no comprendemos la tauromaquia sin matar. La tauromaquia reclama la muerte porque es un sacrificio.
¿Y la gente esperan la muerte del torero o no?
Realmente yo creo que el sacrificio, la base y la estructura profunda del sacrificio siempre es la muerte de un hombre. Todo sacrificio se está montado sobre el derramamiento de sangre, que es lo que fertiliza y fecunda la vida y la relación entre todos nosotros. El toro es una religión sacrificial. La religión cristiana es una religión sacrificial. La religión judía es una religión sacrificial. Todos tenemos en común el sacrificio. La sangre es el símbolo de la vida.
In the city of Cadiz, Providence furnished a Mediterranean kingdom with an Atlantic harbor from which to sail to a new world. you get a panoramic impression from the Camera Obscura, part of the touristic charm of what is now just another Spanish port.
Now we are going to see the port. Okay? Here.
On August the 2nd, 1492, Cadiz was full of departing ships, crammed with the last 8,000 Spanish Jews, holding one-way tickets for an unknown destination. Columbus and his crew, which contained several Jewish sailors, were forced to sail from the little port of Palos, further up the coast. The name means literally the sticks. They couldn't sail until the Inquisition had seen the last Jew over the horizon and waited for August the 3rd to dawn on their knees in the Church of St. George.
It's not easy to imagine the Thursday night in the August of 1492 when this church was filled with all the greatest dignitaries of Spain, including, of course, the Catholic kings, Ferdinand and Isabella. They went together from here, you might say, from this harbour, with Christopher Columbus to discover America, gold, and souls for the church to save. Only a few years earlier, a Genoese adventurer like Columbus might have expected to make his fortune to the east, but Byzantium had been captured by the Turks, and the whole of the eastern Mediterranean was closed off to Christianity. And so the whole enterprise was turned westwards. The sea has left this place, but something of the air of hope and discovery still remain here. Columbus, of course, discovered America, that's one thing. But America also discovered Columbus and his consequences, which was another.
He never found the gold he sought, but at least Christopher Columbus has his statue amidst the traffic of Mexico City. There is no monument to his successor, Hernán Cortés, who made Mexico Catholic with gunpowder, steel, and chickenpox. This isn't the airport, but a moving walkway at the shrine of the Virgin of Guadalupe, the Indian Madonna, whose miraculous image appeared on the Cape of Don Diego, one of the Spanish friars who came to conquer the New World, theologically. There was no shortage of gods in ancient Mexico. Even today, just who was and wasn't in the pantheon causes some confusion. The statues of the last Aztec emperor but one.
Este tipo es esquí.
Huitláhuac. Huitláhuac.
¿Huitláhuac? ¿Quién era?
Dios del agua.
Dios del agua. Bueno, ¿usted cree a este Dios?
Sí.
¿Estos dioses viven ahora en México o no?
No, eran ya miles de años, hace miles de años, otra vez, de eso de, ¿qué será? Antes de Cristo, ¿verdad?
No, después de Cristo.
The great church of the Virgin of Guadalupe is a rallying point for Mexicans. Like so many symbols, it has a double meaning. It proves that Catholicism subjugated Mexico, and that Mexico has subjugated Catholicism, converting its trinity to become Mexico's own unique divinity, or divinities. The Zocalo in Mexico City was once the Aztec temple precinct. It was filled with trees until 1968, when students used them for barricades. They were massacred, just as the Aztecs had been. Mexico is built on skulls. The capital stands on the skeleton of Tenochtitlan. When the conquistadors arrived in 1520, they found a city with more people than London, more canals than Venice, and more pyramids than Egypt.
It's part of the myth that the Spaniards were very eager to believe that they brought civilization to Mexico. But civilization means what goes on in cities. And this city of Tenochtitlan, all of which has disappeared except for this maquette that the pigeons strut on, just as the Spaniards strutted through its streets
That city was much bigger than any city that the Spaniards had ever seen, and it totally amazed them. So in a sense, you could say that the pre-Columbian Mexicans were more civilized than the Spaniards who conquered them. It's a sad commentary on European civilization that all they could think to do with it was to smash it up.
The Aztecs may have been more civilized or more cruel than their conquerors. They were certainly more godly. Enrique Florescano knows their gods well.
Su gran dios Quetzalcóatl es un dios del maíz, es un dios que encarna el proceso de la agricultura. Él muere en el otoño y luego es enterrado en principios de la primavera y renace en el verano. O sea que él es un espejo del proceso agrícola, de la muerte y el renacimiento de la vida, del ciclo continuo de la naturaleza. Y los mexicanos antiguos no adoraban, no tenían la idea de la muerte que tenemos los occidentales. Ellos pensaban que era un ciclo continuo de perecimiento, declinación y renacimiento y vida.
En cierto senso, si pregunta siempre si eran algunos aztecas que no creían en sus dioses. Ahora en el occidente hay mucha gente que no creen. ¿Era posible de no creer?
No. En una sociedad como la sociedad mesoamericana, la maya, la azteca, la zapoteca, no, porque desde que nacía el niño estaba encerrado en un círculo comunitario que le enseñaban que la vida no tiene razón más que como proyecto de la comunidad. No hay una vida individual, no hay la idea occidental de la realización de la existencia personal. Eso no existe en la cultura mesoamericana. Nunca existió. Entonces, desde el principio, los niños tenían una idea comunitaria, una idea, una socialización total. Y esa socialización les enseñaba que ellos eran solamente una parte del conjunto y que la realización individual tenía sentido para la comunidad.
Tula isn't the most exciting pre-Columbian site, but it is a crucial one. Though it was never theirs, Aztecs, whether ancient or modern, could not, cannot leave it alone.
These huge warriors were not Aztecs, they were Toltecs. And they were in fact warriors who, for a while, dominated this site and built this city, but were eventually defeated and crushed. The Aztecs wanted to believe that they had taken on their magic. They wanted to believe it very badly, but they somehow didn't quite believe that they had. So every now and again, the Aztec emperor would send a messenger all the way from Teotihuacan, a pretty long journey, about 100 kilometers, in order to discover from the old ladies who lived still on this site of Tula whether or not he'd been doing a good job and whether the Aztecs, who'd built an enormous city, very much greater than Tula and much more impressive, had at last earned the respect of the Toltecs who still lived here. And the comedy of it is that however often they sent these messengers and whatever gifts they brought, whatever images they brought of the work they had done, and they were very good painters, the old ladies never ever gave them a good notice. So every time they traipsed back and told the emperor that it really wouldn't do. And for some reason, although he was not exactly delighted by criticism, he seemed always to have listened ruefully to this and tried to do better.
Coming away from Tula, you sort of find yourself thinking how gods and civilizations
have in common an extraordinary capacity for swallowing and a relatively limited capacity for digesting. So there's always a kind of burp of apprehension on the part of the dominant culture when it tastes again the flavor of what it's swallowed. And at that point, it can do two things. It can either acknowledge the flavor or try to repress it. In fact, most cultures try to have it both ways. For instance, the Roman Catholic Church swallowed the Roman gods just as it swallowed the Mexican gods. And in a way, it pretended that they had all been false and got rid of, but they also used them to make saints and to enjoy the habits of worship that the people had had before the Christian God came along. I suppose the truth is religions and cultures subscribe to the old rule of dog eat dog. And if you reverse dog, you get God, and God eats God.
Quetzalcoatl, the peace-loving god-king of Tula, was conquered, so the legend says, by force of alcohol. Tezcatlipoca, the bloodthirsty god that the Aztecs took to their hearts, filled him with fermented cactus juice, or pulque. He drank himself into obscurity, slept with his sister, and fled in shame across the sea. The mariachis sing this song about a king who loses everything but remains a king. The legends said that Quetzalcoatl would one day return as a messiah, bearded and blanched in a fresh white skin, like Hernán Cortés. When the Spaniard arrived, the Aztec emperor Moctezuma II thought his time was up. Professor Alfredo López Austin says there was surprise on both sides.
¿Cómo han visto los españoles los aztecos y los aztecos los españoles?
Bueno, la sorpresa fue sumamente grande porque los españoles tenían una idea de lo que era el mundo que ellos llamaban infiel, pagano, pero esta fue una realidad para ellos totalmente distinta. Se encontraron con un mundo en el que incluso los dioses les parecieron que existían, pero ellos calificaron como demonios. Para los indígenas fue también una cosa muy extraña ver a hombres que tenían un color distinto, que traían caballos, son venados enormes sin cuernos, que tenían una tecnología desarrollada, muy desarrollada, sobre todo la pólvora y el hierro, y eso provocó en ellos un sentimiento de que estaban tratando con dioses, o cuando menos con representantes de un dios muy poderoso que se había ido, Quetzalcóatl, y que ahora regresaba con un mensaje nuevo. Eso no se puede generalizar, pero evidentemente muchos creyeron que los españoles eran hijos de Quetzalcóatl.
To my mind, the greatest civilization of old Mexico was not Aztec, but Mayan. Chichen Itza is only one of their superb cities.
The Greek philosopher Heraclitus once said that war was the father of all things. It's not really a particularly popular view, particularly in those who suppose that Jesus, for instance, was the Prince of Peace. But there was also the case, wasn't there, of onward Christian soldiers. So there's a kind of balance in religion between the peaceful and the warlike. And as far as the Mayans were concerned, the warlike predominated completely. This elegant palace is actually devoted to the warriors. And this is the sacrificial stone which the warriors were devoted to procuring hearts for. The Mayans sacrificed a large number of their prisoners. They didn't do it in quite the same horrifyingly programmatic way as the Aztecs. There was a kind of balance in the Mayans which was completely lost by the Aztecs. But you can't hide from yourself the fact that they too were devoted to blood.
If the Aztecs were Mexico's Romans, the Maya were the Greeks. They had music, art, and science, but no theater. Instead, they had the ball game. 9 forms of the pre-Columbian game survive, but only just. much of the flavour of the ancient sport has been lost, as has the practice of sacrificing key players at full time. Rural matches such as this one entice anthropologists away from the metropolis.
The players are practically undressed, and they have a deerskin girdle, but the most important part is the leather strap that goes right under their buttocks, because that prevents them from getting a hernia from the muscles and the tendons just ripping open. Part of the time the ball is going flying up and they're hitting it hip to hip, and part of the time it's on the ground. And I find that they get very excited about being on the ground. And what they tell me is that when it's on the ground, the game really can go on.
There was a famous English football manager called Bill Shankly, and he once said that football was not a matter of life and death. It was much more important than that. I have a feeling that the ball game has something in common with Shankly's view of things. Is that right?
Totally. It's the basis of the creation myths, at least among the Maya. It's a cosmic relationship between the living who return, revive through the process of fertility, dying, and being reborn through the new generations, and the gods. And that is a cosmic relationship, and it has to do with the creation myths.
The gods also played the ball game, didn't they?
Yes, there's this wonderful reference to the Sitlal Tlachtli. Sitlal is the stars, Tlachtli, the ritual court of the stars, where the gods are going to play out. The human passions are also projected onto the gods, the way that man needs them to bring the rain, to make sure that the world lives on.
Is it true that on certain occasions the winning team was sacrificed? Can you supply a logic for that of some kind?
Well, it's an honor. It's an honor. In other words, you've won, and it is an honor to be sacrificed because it is your blood that is going to be, you're going to be decapitated. Your blood is going to be strewn on the court, and it is this blood that is going to fertilize. It is going to fertilize the world and help the cycle to continue.
The Great Pyramids of Chichen Itza, remarkable, sublime, give them whatever adjectives you like. They were also the site of sacrifices. Bodies were thrown down these steep steps. Some of humanity's most beautiful buildings were erected for inhumane purposes. Those who built great cities often had pious blood on their hands. My heart may have been in my mouth after climbing up, but at least the tourist isn't greeted by God's servants, armed with knives.
We're quite used to thanking God, but we're not much in the way of blaming gods. The Mayans were, I suppose, lucky with their gods because it procured them this great site and the energy to develop it in the way that they did. They were also very unlucky. In the middle of the last century, the Mayans, who had never really been conquered by the Spaniards as the Aztecs had been, revolted against the Central Power. It wasn't the Spaniards anymore, but it was their descendants, and they were at least as cruel to the Mayans as the Spaniards had been, and largely enslaved them in their huge estates. So they rebelled, the Mayans, and for a while they had the best of it. And it looked as though the old warrior tradition would finally procure their freedom again. But their god let them down. He let them down because he was the maize god. And when the moment came, the maize began to grow, and the Mayans gave up their fight and ran away. Not because they were defeated, not because they were frightened, but because the crop had to be gathered.
October the 4th, and the mountain village of Quetzalan is filled to capacity for the festival of San Francisco. Peasants come in and occupy the village, which is normally very middle class. They first prove their Christian piety in the very European-style church. The devotions over, they don the old costumes and dance with the old spirit. One set of dancers skip and prance to revive the cosmos and keep the stars in their places, while others dance out a story that is 4 centuries old. By their masquerade, these performers mock their conquerors, as well as lampooning their mounted grandeur. Comedy is often the revenge of the underdog.
This is the enactment of the conquest of Mexico by the Spaniards, by the Indians whom they conquered. You can pick out the Spaniards because they've got crosses and swords. Both of them were used to crush the resistance of the local people.
The mask, so important in Mexican tradition, hides and liberates. The decoration of Ruth Lechuga's flat testifies to her position as the leading authority on the subject.
The masks are used mainly in dances, some ceremonies like Eastern ceremonies. The Jews, again, in Eastern ceremonies are masked because they are the bad ones. They are the ones who killed Jesus Christ. But in other things, they are just dances with many different themes.
They are always directed towards the Catholic God and the Virgin.
Well, yes, Mexico is on the surface a Catholic country, and there are very few Indian groups which are not even superficially Catholic. But the Catholicism is something very movable. They still believe in the sun and the moon and the earth and the water and the fire.
Is sacrifice still a part of what the Indians do in their religion and call it Christianity or not?
Well, there are certain sacrifices of animals in some places, but mostly the sacrifice is in the dance itself. If you dance the whole day under the bright sunshine with a very heavy costume and a mask over the face, it's a sacrifice.
Here we are in your bedroom, Ruth, and I see that you sleep with death, so to speak. As you know, in Greek mythology, death and sleep were closely related. You're not afraid to sleep with death?
No, because those masks came to stay here mainly because they're mainly white, and it contrasts very well with the color of the wall.
The highlight of the day is very high indeed. After a suspenseful period of prayers and chanting, the veladores, flying men, boost themselves from their launch pad and become stars in their airy field.
I guess these are really the first spacemen, because they represent the celestial bodies as they fly around, and they're completely pre-Christian, pre-Columbian.
The more daring Indians did not and do not wait for death before ascending to heaven. The Franciscans and the Dominicans competed with the Indians and each other in creating places of worship. Both Christian fraternities stole from existing monuments and recycled them as fortresses of the faith. One such is the Church of the Shrine of Our Lord of Chalma, that draws 3 million pilgrims a year, many of whom finish the journey not on foot, but shufflingly on their knees. The faithful come to celebrate a supposed miracle which took place in a nearby grotto. The The priest who led me there is himself evidence of another kind of miracle. He's Aztec by origin and Catholic by vocation.
Es vascuence. Sí. Ibarra. Pues. Cañada la Cañada. El otro apellido es Carrillo, también es español. Sí. Por tanto, pues aprecio mucho mi sangre en lo que tengo de español y aprecio mucho la sangre de mi raza azteca. Bueno. Soy el mestizaje de ambas. No sabemos exactamente el tiempo, el año, en que los indígenas hayan empezado a adorar aquí a una estatua, a un ídolo. Lo que sí sabemos con certeza es que en 1539, cuando los padres agustinos vinieron de Ocuilan, Malinalco, a visitar estas tierras con el fin de evangelizar a la gente que acudía aquí, pues se dieron cuenta que ya aquí había un culto. Ellos pensaron poner una cruz aquí para, en relación con la cruz, hablarles del misterio de Cristo. Por tradición, porque de esto no habrá pruebas nunca, por tradición de boca en boca y de familia en familia, se ha venido transmitiendo la noticia, la noción de que había aparecido aquí el Cristo en la cruz sin que lo trajera nadie. Que eso lo crea usted o lo crea yo, bueno, eso se queda ya a cada quien.
Si un peregrino pregunta a usted la misma pregunta, ¿qué ha pasado veramente en la cueva? ¿Qué diría usted?
Al peregrino le digo yo, si tú crees que él se apareció milagrosamente, pues síguelo creyendo. Pero yo no lo creo.
Bueno. La aparición de la imagen del Virgen, su vestido de Don Diego, ¿usted piensa que la misma cosa es verdad?
Bueno, yo entiendo que ha habido muchos estudios. Y ahí, aunque no es dogma de fe, ahí sí está uno tentado a creer una aparición en el lienzo, en la tela aquella del ayate de Juan Diego.
Sí.
Porque cuando el Papa no ha dicho tienen que creer porque anatema sit, bueno, no ha dicho nada. No. Entonces, pero sí sería un tanto peligroso pues para un cristiano católico. Estamos hablando de la Virgen de Guadalupe, sí, ¿no? Sí. Pues ponerse en contra de lo que tanto se ha demostrado ya, porque se han hecho estudios. Sí. Aquí no se ha hecho estudio ninguno.
Very good answer.
The friars converted Mexico, on the surface. Under the crust, old beliefs and rituals lived on, and still do. In San Pablito dwells a white witch, famous for her efficiency. Our driver had been suffering from gout in his accelerating and occasionally braking foot. The local medical expert explained that the problem had been diagnosed as the fault of evil spirits. They must be driven out.
Now she's going to give a cigarette.
So each of these spirits that are going to be destroyed are being given a cigarette.
Yeah, because of bad people, they die on the street. They die with a knife. You know, they die with a gun. You know, bad people, they die with the alcoholic. You know, the alcoholic to give again the things they use when
you give to them the things which destroyed them.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yes. So before being got rid of, before the execution, as it were, they get a last cigarette. Is this lady feared in the village?
No, because it's like a doctor. Because 100 years ago, we don't know the doctor, you know. So people, they have to use that when somebody's sick. And so of course we have to be grateful with that woman, you know.
Yes. Is there a priest in this village?
Yes.
Does he approve of what she does?
Yes.
She's a Christian for him?
Yes. We believe both religion.
Yes.
Because this is the religion, we have the traditional.
You believe in both Christianity and in the traditional religion? I guess we have a bit of a bad conscience about this because that chicken was killed, I suppose, because we were there. It's strange, really, how one wants to prevent people from doing things like that. One becomes, in spite of oneself, a bit of an inquisitor. Here we are, reasonable people. Here you are doing something unreasonable. Stop it. What are we going to stop? Not a lot. We shall continue to eat frozen chicken and enjoy various other things that we want to do with chickens. We just don't want you to do that. The fact of the matter is, I don't know whether people feel better after the therapy of chickens than they do after going to see their analysts. It's certainly cheaper to have the chicken treatment than the analytic.
Today's Mexicans may be advancing economically, but there's a strong movement back to their Aztec roots. These genially fundamentalist Aztecs call themselves campesinos, peasants. What's folkloric in the open air is a little strange in a Mexico City living room. Soledad Ruiz, dressed as an Aztec in full fig, is slightly more, well, improbable. Her accountant friend Antonio Pina provided a suitably dressed interpreter of the world they both hold dear.
¿Qué significa esto?
Esta es una danza dedicada al dios mismo de la danza, que en nuestro país lleva el nombre de Huehuecoyotl. Hay toda una leyenda en torno a este ser que se supone que en tiempos muy antiguos fue un gran danzante y un buen día, danzando, se elevó. No, ahora sí que con todo y guaraches, porque estos no son zapatos.
Sí.
El atuendo. Entonces se le llamó pues el dios de la danza, pero se cuenta que fue un ser que realmente existió.
Pero usted, señor Piña, ¿es una danza cristiana o una danza pagana?
Bueno, es una danza prehispánica. Digo, ya la división entre cristiano y pagano puede denotar cierto menosprecio hacia lo pagano, ¿no? Y en México, pues lo característico es el sincretismo entre nuestras tradiciones prehispánicas y nuestras tradiciones cristianas.
Pues no hay una contradicción entre este tipo de danza y el cristianismo occidental.
Y yo veo ahora mucho interés, cosa que hace unos 25, 30 años realmente no existía, ¿no? Pero con esta caída de las ideologías, pues la gente de cualquier manera quiere tener algo en que creer, ¿eh?
Sí, pero creer es peligroso, ¿no es verdad? Porque los aztecos, evidentemente, creían mucho en sus dioses.
Sí.
Y por eso han matado enormemente de gente para sacrificarlos a estos dioses.
Bueno, yo creo que en todas las etapas de la historia y de las culturas hay un momento en que se producen los sacrificios humanos.
Sí.
Todas las matanzas en las guerras de religión entre protestantes y católicos eran sacrificios humanos. Todas las matanzas por cuestiones ideológicas, ya no digamos la que realizó el nazismo, pues evidentemente que fueron sacrificios humanos a una escala muy superior a la que nunca realizaron los...
¿no? Ustedes están así como muy asustados del sacrificio. ¿Qué sería la existencia misma, el universo, sino el resultado de un tremendo sacrificio? Yo, claro, me declaro cristiana, pero estoy muy imbuida de ideas prehispánicas que son, como usted decía, catalogadas como paganas y que yo no considero peyorativo. Es decir, de verdad, hay muchas ideas que corresponderían a ese periodo que siguen siendo valiosísimas, ¿no?
There's something about Mexico which makes one surprised to find death having its own space, because in the great Indian sites in Mexico City and here in Yucatan, you don't find any graveyards. In a sense, I think you could say that the dead were too useful to the ancient Aztecs and the ancient Mayans to be shunted off into a quiet and neglected corner like this one. What exactly have you learnt about life and death in Mexico? And what's God got to do with them? Well, I think God's really got a great deal to do with them, depending whether you're talking about that God, Christian God in the sky, or the gods of the Mexicans. In fact, they had a very similar morality in an extraordinary number of ways, including the idea of an afterlife. Death itself, however, was regarded somewhat differently. It was something which was owed to Mother Earth for the maize that one had eaten during one's life. One took from the ground and one went back to the ground. And the infant that dies, do you want to hear this? The infant that dies before it has a chance to eat has a second chance at life. A charming notion. Like so many religious notions, one would like to believe it, but I can't.
Nowhere in Mexico seems so divinely Mayan as Uxmal. Built around a great court that might grace an ancient university, this was actually a vast spiritual center. The Mayans were as cunning as the Greeks when it came to architecture. So much of what appears true is untrue. Doorways and windows appear symmetrical from a distance, only because they are asymmetrical. This roof appears straight because it's raised in the middle. Here, truth and falsehood depend on each other. And the same seems to me to be true of gods. What you see is seldom what you get.
The great thing about Uxmal is the wonderful use of space, the relationship of the buildings to each other, the use of space within the courtyard. All of this speaks of a society full of movement and excitement and a sense of community. Perhaps this community was almost exaggerated, because if one wants to understand what happened here, one has to understand that these people could only think the religion which they lived. Plato thought the society should be very much like this: the rulers, the warriors, the workers, all knowing their places, all subscribing to exactly the same values. And a great many religions have mimicked this: Islam, fundamental Judaism, and fundamental Christianity. It's admirable and it's horrible. It's horrible, it seems to me, because a society where nobody can think anything but what everybody else thinks is a society which is frozen in its own rituals and its own sacred spaces. I prefer a society which is elastic, which can bend, which has variety and oppositions in it. And I hope you do.
Plymouth, Massachusetts, where the Pilgrim Fathers and the Christian God first landed in New England.
Know that he had made his mind so clear that he would be fully a friend to the English. And in truth, the man that had dropped his...
When did you get here?
16 and 20, sir.
How?
I did come out on that fast ship called Mayflower with my wife and 2 young sons and some 100 other passengers. We are most zealous to live as the Lord's people and to obey his commandment and to understand our work in the world as a thing of his will.
Were you greatly welcomed here by the people who lived here before you got here?
We have hopes that the Lord hath his elect amongst these, as amongst all the nations, and that his intent in sending us here is that we might be his instruments in bringing them forth unto the true faith.
Well, let me disabuse you of your hopes, because coming from a few centuries later, I'm able to tell you that very few American Indians survived the good offices of the white people who came here, and that those who did were often robbed, if not murdered. So finally, perhaps you will be disappointed to hear that these fine hopes of yours were not realized. And I wonder to what degree the belief in a single God, whose word was not to be gainsaid,
contributed to the vanity of those who almost exterminated the Indians?
Oh, this goes beyond my understanding, sir.
If you can't be in at the creation, you can be in at the remake. And this is a remake of the first community which the Puritans who came from England built here, or very near here, at Plymouth. In a strange way, the people who come back to it, I suspect, are not actually of English descent at all. They come back to look at roots which actually weren't theirs. But Americans have a tremendous desire to trek back to their places of origin and validate themselves if they can by that means, even if they aren't all that valid.
The Pilgrim Fathers had fled the intolerance of the Stuart kings in Old England, but their own brand of intolerance was part of their spiritual baggage. The Puritans took over the East, their descendants and later immigrants won the West and carved its wilderness into a parody of the East. God and Mammon soon went into partnership. The Crystal Cathedral in Los Angeles, the city of the angels. Disneyland is just down the road. Why are we inclined to mock this Chartres of the West, but never Chartres itself? Here the stained glass window moves and speaks. Why is one cathedral great art and the other great kitsch? In the land of the automobile, isn't it natural to come in and pray at the wheel? Why wouldn't you?
I don't know whether God is any more present here than he is in the cathedrals of Spain or the temples of the Incas or wherever. I suppose he's here more than he is there, in the sense that there are, after all, people listening to this man, draped in robes which no American Democrat would normally wear, miming some kind of majesty which doesn't exist in this country, for the sake of a God who is supposedly majestic and autocratic in the way that no American would endure in any being that wasn't supernatural.
I mean, here is a person who has been flat on his back for the last 4 months. The only thing he can do is to watch the rising and setting of the sun and to watch sitcoms on television. He has faced things that I have never faced in my life. He's a real warrior.
Curious. In this country where the national creed says, like Jerry Maguire, show me the money, and most programs on TV celebrate violence, youth, and get up and go, this preacher makes a hero of someone incurably flat on his back. He does also like his congregation to show him their money.
Are you Christians?
Yeah.
Okay. And what does that mean?
That means that we believe in God, and we're Protestant. We're non-denominational.
Yes.
So we're not religious, we're spiritual. We just go, we read the Bible, we go to God, and we just go to church.
I noticed that there's more emphasis on Jesus than there is on God. How do you understand the relationship between Jesus and God?
Jesus is God's son, and in a way, like, our human minds can't understand it, but in a way they're the same person. You know what I mean?
You think I should understand it, although you don't?
What?
You think I should understand it, even though you don't?
Well, what I'm saying is that we can't, our human minds, we can't concept that, but God, Jesus is God's son. He gave us Jesus he put Jesus on this earth to die for our sins.
Okay.
And
they're separate, and yet at the same time they're the same.
They're the same.
But we belong to the Church of Religious Science.
What is that exactly?
And that is a new thought a church that believes that God is all there is. God is in each and every one of us. God is good. God is love.
Have you always taken this view your whole life, or was there a moment when you changed?
I was born and raised Catholic.
That's very interesting.
Yes.
What is the difference between the Catholic God and the Protestant God as you see it that made you change?
Man-made rules. I was divorced, and therefore I could not participate fully in my religion. Science of Mind believes in a personal God. What God is to you, I feel much closer to God. I don't have all the ceremony and the ritual, and I'm like God. I go to God. He and I together. There's no go-between.
Boston, hometown of John Fitzpatrick Kennedy, a city famous for its Catholics and for hostility to them. The Protestants were here 2 centuries before Mother Church. When the mostly Irish Catholics arrived, they were ghettoized, demonized, and terrorized. The land of the free was freer for some than for others.
This noisy backwater in a Boston suburb was the site of the Ursuline convent, which in 1834 was burnt down by an angry Protestant mob. It's said that one of the nuns, at least, perished in the flames. What was repugnant and unusual was the fact that the mob not only burnt down the convent, but prevented fire brigades from putting out the flames. And 1 or 2 of the fire brigades, composed of Protestants, were apparently not reluctant to depart. This began a long history of division between Protestants and Catholics in Boston, a division which was very like a war.
In Boston's Jesuit College, 93-year-old Father William Leonard tends an archive of Catholic incunabula. He has witnessed things which were once unthinkable: the first Catholic president of the United States, the end of the Latin Mass, and growing mutual tolerance among Bostonians.
I think the war changed everything. For one thing, minorities, Catholics, Jews, were given responsibility, offices, and they discovered that they could satisfactorily fill those positions. Then we fought side by side, really. You can't really scorn too long the man who stands behind you or sits with you in a foxhole waiting for an attack, you know. So I think that made tremendous differences in our attitudes toward one another. Much more acceptance.
Do you have friends among the Protestant clergy now?
Oh, I just came from a meeting, you might say, last Thursday evening. We have a Boston Ministers Club here, and about 30 to 40 members, and we meet each month. We have drinks before dinner, unless we're visiting a Methodist home. In that case, we don't. Right. And then we have dinner, and somebody reads a paper. Very pleasant.
And is this by contrast with what would have been true 50, 60 years ago?
Oh, I can't imagine they're inviting a papist priest to membership. Nor can I imagine a papist priest being caught dead among them, you know?
Is that right? It's a common feature of pioneers and their followers that they cross deserts or wildernesses and finally arrive at a promised land. And when Brigham Young, the leader of the Mormons, took his few faithful and persecuted followers across the United States, he was the person on whom they depended, as the children of Israel did on Moses, to decide where and when they were going to stop. As we all know, Moses never made it to the Promised Land, but Brigham Young did better. He did, in fact, become a very considerably important and rich figure here in what had been a wilderness, which, because he said, "This is the place," became what it now is.
Salt Lake City. Not everyone is allowed into the Mormon temple, its Holy of Holies, but the nearby tabernacle, the ancient Israelites built the first one, has a wider welcome on its mat. It's famous for its choir and its bigger-than-yours organ. Brigham Young's town. Impressive, clean, safe. A promised land of milk and honeyed words.
This is a volunteer service for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's good to be here to meet people from all over the world and to get to know them and their beliefs. Right now we're just gonna give you about 60 seconds to turn to your neighbor who you do not know and...
Why is it that when I hear the word community, or I'm incited to take a stranger to my heart, I long to bury my head in a good book?
So you are missionaries, is that the correct term?
Missionaries, missionary guides.
I take it the word missionary means what it means to anybody else, which is that you are involved in trying to persuade, charm, and reason people into joining the Mormon Church. Is that right?
Do you mind if I answer? Go right ahead. We share with people our personal feelings about the church as well as the basic beliefs of the church. And we give them an opportunity to learn more and we either accept the gospel and maybe possibly join the church, which is also enjoyable to us, or to learn more and come closer to Christ.
What is the ingredient of the Mormon faith which makes you a Mormon missionary and not a Catholic missionary?
We're sharing with people not a church built up by men, but actually a restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ. It's wonderful news, and it's up to each of us to
So
share
that is what the
with
Latter-day Saints bit means.
Latter-day Saints, right. The Church of Jesus Christ, meaning the Church of Christ in the ancient days, and Latter-day Saints to distinguish it from that church.
Who are saints? Are you saints? Are all members of your church saints?
We consider anyone who's following after Jesus Christ to be a saint, just as they used it in the New Testament times, and they refer to those people as saints.
So this is just a holy person, so to speak. It's
No,
not...
that's the misconstrued conception. I think of it today. We're not perfect. Of course, I'm getting close. I'm just kidding.
Mormons claim that in 1830, their founders were in receipt of God's last word, inscribed on gold plates and carried by an angel. However, it's not for this remarkable apocalypse that they are most renowned.
I'd like to reassure everyone that that has not been practiced for over a century, and in fact anyone is excommunicated from the church who does live polygamically. But in an earlier period where it was something of a theocracy out here, there was a revelation and a direction from God that that was an acceptable practice. There's certainly biblical origins for that, but at the time and at the moment that it became illegal to do so with legislation in the United States, then the church ceased to practice it.
Let me come to the golden tablets, which were said by Joseph Smith, I think, to have been shown to him by an angel, and on which the Books of Mormon, if not in their entirety, certainly in their basic
At least
tenets,
the portion we have now, yes,
were written.
for sure.
These tablets have not been, so to say, recently seen. They are not on display. You cannot show them. No, not any more than the Jews can the Ten Commandments.
Having the gold plates to handle, you're right, they're not available, and they haven't been from the beginning. We do have affixed to the opening pages of the Book of Mormon the witnesses of 3 men and then 8 men, a total of 11, who saw the plates, held them, turned the leaves, saw the angel, and affixed forever their name to that testimony. And the deepest feeling of my heart is that it's true, that it's a revelation from God, and that, as my own great-great-grandfather said when he joined this church, he said, a bad man could not have written the book, and a good man would not have written it, except directed by God.
Man cannot live by bread alone, nor very long without it. These whiter-than-white loaves are baked by Mormon volunteers. These charitable Latter-day Saints help to feed the hungry under the unblinking eyes of the church's ruler, the prophet, and his apostles. This bread is never going to be for sale. It's cast on the waters, or rather given away. In God's supermarket, there are no cash registers.
People come here who are in need. They are hungry, and their local bishops or the church leader in their area sends them here to receive food commodities.
They have to be members of your church in order to qualify?
Not necessarily. The bishop or the leader of a local congregation is responsible to help anyone who lives in that geographic area. Some of the vegetables are grown on local church welfare farms. Others we do buy commercially with funds which are donated by members of the church on a day that we call Fast Sunday. Once a month, members of the church are asked to fast for one day and donate the value of those meals. People not only have the chance to give, but are spiritually strengthened as they fast, and because of that, others can receive. And it's not unlike the teachings of Jesus Christ throughout the years. He cared for people in need. He helped them. That was his work, was to care for the hungry. And once a person is fed, then you have the chance to teach them.
America is a promised land that has to keep on making promises. Its materialism tinkles like a Buddhist shrine. Americans move forwards and backwards at the same time, brightening their future with spiritual antiques from a past they think they're glad to have left behind. Welcome to Chicago, Illinois. The Midwest is America at its most American, and some say its least appealing. And its most godly? If you say so. Here they invented the skyscraper, a way of climbing to heaven before you die. Jacob's ladder with express elevators. But even in this cutthroat city, the gods of the old world have taken root.
This is the Grand Hospital, Chicago, the maternity wing. It's deserted now, but 66 years and a couple of months ago, it was occupied by me and by my mother, who was important to the whole operation. My father was British, my mother American, but both of them were Jews. And so, although I was born in the land of the free, where supposedly one may choose what one wants to be and how one wants to be it, what religion one has, what career one follows, the truth of the matter was that, in a way, the infant Raphael, who was born somewhere around here, was already determined by his birth to be a Jew. 1931 was in the middle of the Depression. America seemed to be run entirely by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, the WASPs. I was brought up to believe that to be an American Jew was to aspire to be like a WASP. We were supposedly as good as they were, but they didn't know that yet. Jews had to go twice as far to get half as far, and various things like that. Not particularly intimidating, but limiting. There were still hotels which excluded Jews, and dogs, I was told, though I never actually saw a sign that said that. As far as the black people were concerned, they were even more limited, and it was the Jews' proud notion that they were going to assist the blacks and themselves to rise in the social scale. Now something rather different has happened over 60 years later. The Jews are no longer the sponsors of black emancipation. They are, in some sense, the chosen enemies of certain black movements. That's to say, I think that a lot of the hostility is to do with the need which every rising and militant group has to find an enemy of choice, and that enemy has not to be too strong, but has to be declared to be strong.
The Reverend Louis Farrakhan, leader of the Nation of Islam, is not universally revered in America. Some Jews think he's anti-Semitic, whites think he's racist, gays think he's homophobic. A lot of African Americans see him as a messiah. Chicago is his power base.
If it wasn't for the Nation of Islam, Islam as a whole would not have spread in this country. We were the only people receptive to it because we were the only people, by us being the people that were oppressed and being put down here, we were the ones that gravitated to it the most because of our desire for righteousness, our desire for justice.
So it is a matter of dignity and justice as well as faith in a particular God.
Yes. All of that comes with the Creator. Justice, peace, unity.
Have you read the Quran?
Yes, sir.
And for you, that is the holy book?
Yes, sir.
What about other holy books?
Bible, yes. I read the Bible sometimes, and also the Torah.
Do you?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. I haven't read the Torah in a while.
Nor have I.
But, but yes, we do acknowledge that, the Psalms, the Old Testament, the New Testament, as all being the Word of God, as well as the Holy Quran.
In the old days, the black man sang of his resignation with spirituals and of his pain in the blues. And that, Farrakhan implies, is more than enough of that.
This particular meeting is heralded as the Holy Day of Atonement, a phrase which rings strangely in my ears because, of course, it takes over an expression which has been familiar to Jews for centuries. The Day of Atonement is one of the great days in the Jewish calendar when Jews seek to become at one with God by apologizing, as it were, for their sins and seeking to rededicate themselves. So what you find here is that Farrakhan has quite deliberately and perhaps shrewdly taken over a key phrase and appropriated it for the black movement, which he is seeking to create of responsible people who are conscious of what they have done and of what they intend and can do, and who wish to be at one not only with, I assume, God, but also with each other.
What is atonement and who is it for? To the members of the Jewish community. We thank God for giving you a day of atonement that was exclusively yours. But there is no more exclusivity anymore, because what is good for Jews, what is good for Muslims, what is good for Christians is good for the whole human family.
The Nation of Islam has its own newspaper, The Final Call. James Mohammed, its editor, started out, like so many black Americans, as a Christian Baptist.
Why was there a change from the Christian orientation to the Muslim one?
During our time in this country, the contradictions of white supremacy Christianity began to reveal itself, and blacks began to challenge it, even to the point of saying, well, we no longer want a white Jesus Christ hanging in our church. We want a black Jesus Christ hanging in our church. The predominant group in our rallies is Christian. Mm-hmm. It's not Muslim, it's Christian. Christians in America, black Christians, recognize that Minister Farrakhan has a message that they can accept and still remain Christian.
Tell me about the relationship between the faith of the Nation of Islam and participation in American life as it's usually lived. I mean, is there some ambition that you have to be a separate nation, or is that just a way of rallying the people as a social entity?
If America wants to include the black man and woman as equals, giving us fairness, equality, then we have no problem existing in this country. But you cannot dole out things to us and expect us to continue to take crumbs from the master's table. We would then say we cannot have that. We will get up and go build something for ourselves in a land of our own.
The Honorable Louis Farrakhan's message is dressed in the imagery of a desert people, but is delivered to an urban, westernized flock. The Nation of Islam may want a different God from other Americans, but does it really share the same God as Arabs and Pakistanis?
In times of great sorrow, we weep with those who weep and comfort those who need comforted. For through our tears, we reflect the love and compassion of Him who knows the pain of all our sorrows. Life Today with James Robison, because we care about you.
If you want to sell it, put it on TV. Why would God be different? James Robison is a rare breed of TV evangelist. He's not a fraud, and he doesn't do business with hookers. He has built his own TV station, though, on the outskirts of Fort Worth, Texas.
I'm going to have this all card up before you, where she was abused by her first husband. She had back injuries that God healed. Okay.
Okay.
Excuse me.
We're going to hear from a woman, a mother, who was abused in her marriage, was hurt physically, to experience excruciating, unbearable pain, and then move beyond it with a miracle.
They would try anything they could to get me out of pain, but nothing was to work, and then I had to live with it. Well, that was really fun.
A good many of America's 2,500 evangelists do not, let's say, resist temptation. Again and again, their flocks are sheared of all the dollars that can be preached out of them, which is where Ole Anthony comes in. Once a troubleshooter for the US government, Ole has taken a vow of poverty. He's turned a row of former crack dens into a home for refugees from the American nightmare, and makes it his unpaid mission to monitor extortionate TV evangelists. He maintains a vast program archive.
Well, I suppose if you live in God's own country and at the same time the business of America is business, it's not surprising that God has gone into business here. What does that mean in your experience?
It's not, I don't think, that God has gone into business. It's that the people, the supposed men of God, are trying to sell God. And the selling of God, they've put him on the spiritual supermarket, competing with all kinds of other activities, and it's an abomination. Most of them now preach greed. In other words, they preach the 100-fold blessing, or if you give $1, God's going to give you 100 back. And that's the oldest heresy in Christianity. It's called the Cerinthian heresy. And it's the one that says God came to earth, tabernacled, suffered and died and was resurrected so that everybody could be healed, or so that everybody could be rich.
It's a misuse of the parable of the talents, I take it, is it?
Oh, it's terrible. They have mansions and yachts and Mercedes and Porsches and Rolls Royces and everything. They're taking their money to pay for this from the poorest, most desperate people in our society. Do you know that some of the evangelists, you won't believe this one, they have isolated themselves so much from reality that they teach young women on their staffs that their ministry to God is to sexually service them.
I mean, you pursue them, don't you?
We pursue them very actively, proactively.
How do you do that?
Well, we have undercover investigators that get jobs in their organizations. We go through their trash. We follow their money. We use all of the sophisticated techniques that one can conceive of to penetrate this wall that they've created.
Sometimes it's well worth it, sometimes it isn't. Sometimes you get nothing, sometimes you get a lot. It's just like any time you gather intelligence, a little bit there, a little bit here, it may add up to something else.
Ole's SWAT team of spiritual serpicos have just raided the garbage cans of an evangelist they suspect of laundering viewers' cash. The bin bags are checked out down at the car wash.
Yeah, if you're lucky, you may find something to eat. If you're lucky, you may find, you know, a donut or something. I'm kidding, of course.
What's that?
It's very sad because I have a mother myself. Before I came to Trinity Foundation, she was one of those people who would send her last money to pastors like W.R. Shambach, Jimmy Swaggart, Oral Roberts, and her life never ever changed. Nothing ever got better. She never got blessed. I mean, we were living and just surviving. Now I know I would tell her, save you money.
When we first started this, I took a call, and a lady had a son. Yeah, Victims Hotline. A lady had a son who was dying of brain cancer, and she run the medical thing as far as it could go. She went to a TV preacher, a large evangelist in Oklahoma, and a person there told her that she needed to make a donation large enough to hurt her financially to show her faith. Of course, the son died, and she was left with this big debt.
He doesn't look like an enforcer for the mob. He doesn't particularly look like an electricity man. He could be a rent collector, but he doesn't seem to have the muscle. You look so respectable, I took you for some kind of council official. What are you actually?
Well, this is just my normal clothing for work in the house-to-house work of Jehovah's Witnesses.
They've got an awful lot of religions already here. Why do they need you?
Well, you might possibly have answered your own question, because there are so many religions that it's necessary to determine if there is an accurate religion among all that confusion.
The old respectable religions and gods may be coming closer together, but Americans have a tradition of the new. Cults and follow-me messiahs spring up left and right. In the land of religious freedom, could the authors of the US Constitution ever have guessed that the federal government would use its firepower against David Koresh and his sect at Waco? Or that others would retaliate by bombing the federal building in Oklahoma City? Followers of Allah were accused, but the bombers turned out to be homemade Christian neo-fascists. Who expected the mass suicide of the Californian cultists who believed that God was calling them on board a flying saucer to heaven? Old gods that are old gods, but recycled. Come and get them. According to Professor Jeffrey Kaplan, who studies alternative belief systems, American neo-Nazis hanker after pre-Christian deities.
What is the neo-pagan movement? Could you explain a bit about that to me?
Basically a group of widely varied belief systems, widely varied theologies, certainly widely varied practices and theodicies, who group together with the idea that Christianity was imposed on traditional cultures, and that to return to the of tradition, to return to the roots of the folk, if you will, will somehow be ennobling.
Is this a retrieval of ancient Greek and Roman gods, or of American Indian gods, or what? Or all of them?
You name it. The one that I'm most interested in, just from my own research, is the Asatru or Odinist groups, who are bringing back the Norse Germanic pantheon. And
what a grisly thought.
Indeed. Odin, Thor.
What about Wotan? Is he on the way back?
Ah, yes. Wotan is yet another pronunciation used, interestingly enough, by the more racialist or the more political of the community, a minority.
As you can tell from my affectations of English condescension, I'm regarding this as a sort of semi-comic topic. Why is it that you find neo-paganism in some sense attractive, if you do?
Well, I find it attractive because it brings so much fulfillment, so much pleasure, so much of a community to people who, otherwise wouldn't have that, who have found they don't fit well into the society that they're born into. They don't fit well into the religious communities in which they were born. And they go through life in many ways thinking they're alone, thinking there's nobody like them. Then sooner or later they find the fortuitous magazine, the website, the friend in college who tells them that there are others like them, that they would be welcome within this community. And for them, it's a luminous experience. It's extremely important. It brings them to a life and to a fulfillment they otherwise wouldn't have in modern culture, in modern technological culture.
In the American dream, you have a right to be what you believe you are. Isn't that what dreams are for?
No, I think I can handle that all right after all this time. Okay, well, now what do I have to do? Submit request. Well, I suppose having stepped this far, we may as well step a step further. Biff. Got it. Now I suppose one simply has to wait to be revered. I suppose this is actually the final democratization of religion, the final merging of clergy and laity, because all the laity become clerical and all the clerical people presumably become administrators of the laity. Also, the laity are entitled to recruit other people to be reverend, so that finally everybody is to be revered, which is not in itself either unchristian or anything else that I know of. Probably quite a good idea if only it had the faintest vestige of credibility or significance. The other thing is that one is advised to take insurance against any kind of breach of presumably one's reverend activities. I suspect, because suspicion is part of the European game, certainly part of mine, that selling insurance is not the least of the purposes of this apparently genial offer to make everybody reverend. Nice.
Down in the deep south, some start out as Baptist reverends and then have a change of heart and calling.
There seem to be a lot of churches around here, is that right?
There are a lot of churches, large variety. Any kind of religion that you're looking for, you can find in this area. This is the Bible Belt. It's unusual to go maybe 4 or 5 miles without seeing a steeple.
First church that comes to mind is the Southern Baptist Church. Are there many varieties of them, or do they all have the same opinions and a kind of central doctrine? What?
There's so many different kinds of Baptist churches. You have Southern Baptist, you have Independent Baptist, you have Missionary Baptist.
How come there are so many varieties?
Christian churches in general tend to thrive on conflict. Basically, it's where you just had splits within the church.
But is God important in the South still? Does he play a big part in people's attitudes to life and what they choose to do and how they do it?
I tend to think with most people, religion and God play an important part of their life on Sundays.
But not for John David's family. His father, David, has made Saturday their holy day, and he calls it Shabbat, a boldly Semitic move in Athens, Tennessee.
I was a fundamental Baptist preacher, graduated from a fundamental Baptist college. After studying, I discovered that many of the things that I've been taught, that there was no historical basis for it. So as a result of that, I began the journey with my congregation away from traditional Christianity. So we're not Christians. So what
do you call yourselves?
All right, we call ourselves human beings that believe in God.
That's okay.
All right, I think the point is this, that as you begin the journey, you go back. If you go back to the time of Jesus, the Second Temple period, where did Jesus go to church? He went to a synagogue. He taught from the Old Testament scriptures. All right, so if I wanted to teach what Jesus taught, and I wanted to do the things that Jesus did, then I would go to the synagogue, I would associate myself with rabbis, and I would study the Old Testament scriptures. We did not stop there, but we went on back to the earliest writings, and we base our faith not in rabbis or in Judaism, but see, what we do predates Judaism some 2,000 years.
But now you are explaining religion in a way which might lead me to think that you have, so to speak, had enough of it. Is that about right?
I've fed up with it, yes. Some of the greatest people that I've ever met are Christians. They just happen to be wrong doctrinally. But then some of the most vengeful people I've ever met have been Christians also.
Yes.
And so there have been some that have threatened to destroy us. Why do they hate me because I am shooting down the very foundation of their belief system.
David Davis Baptist Church used to have a steeple until he circumcised it with a chainsaw.
Don't rob. And these are not the 10 Commandments either. You understand this? These are just 60 things that you can do to promote social harmony and the correct...
Some of the threats to David Davis's congregation, who call themselves the children of Noah, may be imaginary. Some are certainly not. Many hide from the camera. The Emmanuel Study Center has been menaced by members of the right-wing Christian identity movement.
The social injustice that would be...
This is the land of the free, so watch your back.
Have you always been a godly person, or is this something that's come over you?
Yes, my grandfather was a rural Baptist preacher in Alabama. And so from my youth, I have heard about God, not in the way that the Jews, but in a perverted way through Christianity.
So you've gone back to the Jewish God rather than the Christian God. Is that the truth of it?
I sure have. I sure have.
It's a pretty rare thing for people to do in the South. I don't know, what would your grandfather have thought of that?
Oh, we're here in the Bible Belt, and the people over there where I used to go to church, they know something's taking place, and a lot of them can't understand why I've turned my back on Christianity and Jesus.
Okay, this is the Shabbat, and God said to remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, and the remembrance of the Sabbath is the sanctification. So Jim will do the blessing over the wine.
Amen.
Can this really be happening in the southern United States? Gentiles mouthing Hebrew phrases and earnestly appropriating Jewish rituals in the land of the Ku Klux Klan? Wonders, wonders.
Jim, how far did you get?
To everybody.
You got everybody over there, okay. All right, and then we say Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
And Damon is on the line. Damon, welcome to the program. You're on the air with Don Stewart.
Yeah, my question's in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and the latter part of that, when Paul is kind of saying that the church is like a body.
It's hard for us to imagine on this side what heaven's going to be like because we never have been there, but we know God can and will indeed work it out. All right, let's go now to La Palma, California.
You're older since you started. Are you any wiser? I think I've learnt a lot, but I don't know whether it's wisdom that I've learnt or merely a sense of the strange diversity of human beings. Oh, come on. In your more or less mature opinion, does God exist or not? Well, I'm sure that gods exist because we've seen them in all kinds of forms, but whether God exists in the sense of some all-powerful, all-seeing and all-wise being, well, God knows.
Who keeps the faith anymore? In the old days, a man was a man and a woman was a grateful wife and mother. Things have changed, and according to the Promise Keepers, the fastest growing religious movement in the West, it's time they changed back. Their spiritual inspiration is a once highly successful ex-football coach. Today, Bill McCartney urges his rookies to get their heads down and go for virtue. His vision of an all-male Christian ministry wants men to be reborn to real manhood and cry and hug to celebrate their rebirthdays. Women can wait at home. When these men say they'll be back to put the kids to bed, they mean it. Yes, ma'am. And tell them a story. Ticketed like newborn infants, the Promise Keepers swear to be good husbands, good fathers. They may put their wives on a pedestal, but, so feminists say, they also want women to damn well stay up there, where they can see them. Forget careers and sexual equality. Get up and get under. The male hand on the tiller and the female hand on the stroller. That's God's way. The coach tells it like it is. And to hell with faggots, for instance. promise.
Breathe on us, breathe on us.
Having gone way out, American religion, God help it, and us, is coming home to basics. How different are the 7 vows of the Promise Keepers from the 10 Commandments of the Puritans.
What would have happened if Prince Charles had been a promise keeper? What a difference it would have made for Princess Diana and for the children. Amen? What a tremendous difference it would have made. You know, to follow Jesus Christ is to have the most amazing gifts of God. And then the Christian life is a life filled with God Himself that lands us in heaven when we die. Is Jesus Christ a great Savior or what? What a package He's done for us. Give Him a hand tonight. Give Him a hand. He deserves it.
This is where the Dallas Cowboys usually function, and here is a kind of cowboy for Jesus, I suppose. Easy to mock, but not too loudly, I guess, because these people are, if nothing else, extremely sincere. And they're sincere for something which is very American. Not for some political goal, not for some domination on the part of their race, but curiously enough, a desire to be the people they think they ought to be.
The Bible says, unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you cannot have eternal life.
What kind of God it is that this man is yelling on about. He's a rather vulgar kind of God that a salesman might hector you with and try to persuade you that he would do you good. But maybe he will do them good. Maybe he's the only thing that will make them what they want to be.
Elvis Presley, by the way, when he was a teenager, went to church in the South.
We've been around the world looking for God and gods. And what do we conclude? That probably no one described God's view of man better than Pascal. Does he exalt himself, I lay him low. Does he humble himself, I exalt him, until he comprehends that he is an incomprehensible monstrosity. I shall not leave him at rest. Or as the man more or less said in Sartre's version of the Divine Comedy, on we go. Plymouth Rock, where it all began. I've heard it said that it's a pity that instead of the Pilgrims landing on Plymouth Rock didn't land on the Pilgrims. It didn't. And now it's a shrine, covered with a Greco-Roman canopy, commemorating the Puritans whose purpose in coming to America was to escape everything that the Greek and Roman gods ever stood for.